There is a sandstone valley in New South Wales, Australia, tucked behind a ridge of eucalyptus trees and dry scrub, where the wind moves slowly and the light falls in long golden bands across the rock face during the late afternoon. If you walked there on an ordinary Tuesday, you might think you were simply visiting another stretch of ancient Australian bushland, the kind of landscape that stretches in every direction across this enormous continent, patient and old, and largely indifferent to the people who move through it. You would hear the distant call of a currawong. You might see a goanna watching you from a flat rock, with those amber eyes that seem to have been observing the world since long before curiosity had a name. The air smells of dry earth and eucalyptus oil and something else, something older, something that sits at the back of your nose and makes you slow your breathing without quite knowing why. But then you would round a particular corner and you would stop, cut into the sandstone with a precision and a deliberateness that no amount of erosion or wishful thinking can entirely explain away. Are symbols, rows of them, dozens of them. Some standing alone, some grouped together in formations that suggest grammar, that suggest intention, that suggest a mind working through something it needed very badly to record and preserve. There are figures that look unmistakably like an ancient Egyptian pharaoh in profile, one arm raised, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt rendered in careful lines. There are birds with their wings angled in ways specific to Egyptian hieroglyphic convention. There are seated figures and standing figures and abstract signs that match with a specificity that has troubled serious researchers for decades, the writing system used along the Nile River thousands of years ago. And they are in Australia, not in a museum, not on a replica, not in a recreation centre in a Sydney suburb. They are carved into a cliff face in the Central Coast region of New South Wales, in a place called Kariong, and they have been sitting there through rain and drought and bushfire and the slow turn of centuries, waiting for someone to ask the right question about how they got there. This is not a simple story. Nothing about the Kariong Hieroglyphs is simple. The moment you start pulling at this particular thread, you find that it connects to an enormous tangle of questions about ancient navigation, about the true limits of Bronze Age maritime capability, about the politics of archaeology, about what it means to know something versus what it means to believe something, and about the particular discomfort that comes when a piece of evidence refuses to behave the way it is supposed to behave. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it means more than you might think to see someone in Brisbane at midnight, or someone in Cairo at dawn, or someone in London at 3 in the morning, all drifting towards sleep through the same strange story. We are scattered across this world, and across wildly different hours of the day and night. And somehow we keep meeting in these quiet spaces where history gets strange and the comfortable certainties start to blur at the edges. So settle in. This one is going to take a while, and it deserves the time. The valley where the hieroglyphs are found is called Gosford, and the specific site sits in the Brisbane Water National Park, not far from the town of Kariong on the central coast of New South Wales, roughly an hour north of Sydney. The landscape there is classic Australian bush, the kind that has its own particular beauty if you grow up with it, and that strikes visitors from other parts of the world as austere and slightly prehistoric. The sandstone country of the Central Coast has been home to Aboriginal people for at least 40,000 years, and the rock faces throughout the region are covered in genuine Aboriginal engravings, animals and fish and human figures pressed into the stone by people whose descendants still live on this land today. What makes the Gosford glyphs, as they are sometimes called, so immediately arresting is precisely the contrast. Aboriginal rock art has a particular visual language, one that is immediately recognizable once you have spent any time studying it. The engravings at Kariong look nothing like that. They look with an insistence that is difficult to dismiss, like something pressed out of the Nile Delta and set down in the middle of the New South Wales bush. The site was first formally documented by researchers in the 1970s, though local people had known about it for much longer. The glyphs cover two sandstone walls running parallel to each other, forming a kind of natural corridor about 20 meters long. There are approximately 300 individual symbols carved into the rock. Some are shallow and hard to read in certain lights. Others are quite deep and clearly defined, suggesting they were carved with care and possibly touched up at different points over time. Ray Johnson, an amateur Egyptologist from Sydney, spent years studying the site and eventually published a translation. According to his reading, the glyphs tell the story of an Egyptian expedition to a foreign land, a sea voyage of tremendous distance, the death of a royal son named Nefertiru, and the grief of the sailors who buried him far from home. Johnson identified specific cartouches in the text, the oval outlines that in Egyptian writing frame the names of pharaohs and royalty, and he matched them to rulers from the 4th and 5th dynasties of ancient Egypt, placing the supposed voyage somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. So that would mean Egyptians were in Australia roughly 5,000 years before the first fleet dropped anchor in Sydney Harbour in 1788. Before Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon recorded the first European contact with the Australian mainland in 1606, before any contact between the Old World and this continent that mainstream history currently acknowledges. The implications are staggering, which is precisely why the establishment response was to dismiss the site as a hoax, and precisely why that dismissal has never fully satisfied the people who have actually stood in front of those carvings and looked at them with their own eyes. Let us slow down here, because this story rewards patience. To understand why the Kariong Hieroglyphs matter so much, and why they remain genuinely controversial rather than being simply and cleanly debunked, you need to understand a few things about ancient Egypt, about ancient navigation, and about the particular way that official scholarship sometimes handles discoveries that do not fit comfortably within the accepted framework. Ancient Egypt was not a landlocked civilization. This is a point that tends to get lost in the popular imagination, which often pictures Egypt as a civilization of pyramids and desert and the narrow green corridor of the Nile, turned inward on itself, focused on its monuments and its gods. But Egypt was, for much of its history, a maritime culture. The Egyptians built ocean-going vessels. They sailed the Red Sea regularly, traveling south to a place they called Punt, which many scholars believe was somewhere along the East African coast, or possibly on the Arabian Peninsula, for exotic goods including gold and myrrh and living animals. The harbour of Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast has yielded some of the oldest maritime records ever found. Papyrus logbooks describing the loading and departure of boats more than 4,500 years ago. Egyptian ships could handle open water. That is simply a documented fact. The question of how far they could go, and whether any of them ever went as far as the Indian Ocean, and then further still, remains genuinely open in ways that mainstream archaeology does not always like to acknowledge. The idea that ancient peoples were capable of long-distance ocean travel has been gaining ground steadily over the last several decades. The settlement of Polynesia, which involved navigating across thousands of kilometers of open Pacific Ocean, demonstrates conclusively that ancient people were capable of maritime achievements that Western scholars once dismissed as impossible. Recent genetic research has established that Polynesians made contact with South America long before Europeans crossed the Pacific, a discovery that required a complete rethinking of ancient Pacific navigation. The more we learn, the more consistently we discover that ancient people were doing things we assumed they could not do. Against that backdrop, the idea of an Egyptian vessel reaching Australia sounds less like fantasy and more like a question worth taking seriously. But let us stay grounded, because the Kariong site has attracted not just serious researchers, but also a great deal of fringe theorizing. And part of what makes it difficult to evaluate fairly is that the sensationalism surrounding it tends to drown out the more careful work. So let us talk about what the skeptics say, and let us do so with the same willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The mainstream archaeological position on the Kariong Hieroglyphs is that they are a modern hoax. The argument, put briefly, is that no ancient Egyptian expedition to Australia is recorded in any historical source, that the glyphs show features inconsistent with genuine ancient Egyptian writing, that some of the symbols appear to be drawn from Egyptological reference books published in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and that the sandstone at the site does not show the weathering patterns that would be expected if the carvings were genuinely thousands of years old. These are not trivial objections. Each one deserves to be examined carefully rather than dismissed. But each one also turns out to be more complicated than it appears on the surface. The argument from silence, the fact that no ancient Egyptian source records a voyage to Australia, is the weakest of the objections. We have a tiny, fragmentary fraction of ancient Egyptian records. The dry climate of Egypt has preserved more than most ancient civilizations, but enormous amounts have been lost, destroyed by fires, by floods, by the passage of time, by conquerors who had no interest in preserving the administrative records of the people they had defeated. The absence of a written record is not evidence of absence. It is simply absence of evidence, and those are very different things. The objection about the style of the carvings is more interesting. Professional Egyptologists who have examined photographs and drawings of the site have pointed out that some of the symbols do not match classical Middle or New Kingdom Egyptian hieroglyphics precisely. Some appear to be mirror images of conventional signs. Some show unusual combinations. Ray Johnson's defenders argue that these variations are exactly what you would expect from a group of sailors far from home, working from memory on unfamiliar stone with tools not designed for this purpose, over a period of time and in conditions of grief and desperation. His critics argue that the variations are more consistent with someone copying symbols from a reference book without a full understanding of the system. Both arguments have merit. Neither is conclusive. The question of weathering is genuinely significant because rock art does weather, and the rate and pattern of weathering can sometimes be used to estimate age. Geologists who have examined the site have reached different conclusions. Some say the carvings appear relatively fresh, inconsistent with thousands of years of exposure. Others point out that the protected position of the site in a shaded corridor between two sandstone walls would slow weathering considerably, and that the dense, fine-grained sandstone of the region is particularly resistant to erosion. Some carvings in similarly protected positions in Australia have been dated to tens of thousands of years old and still appear relatively crisp. The truth is that no definitive dating has ever been performed on the Kariong carvings using modern scientific methods. No optically stimulated luminescence testing, no micro-erosion analysis of the kind that can now be applied to rock art. The site has never been subjected to the full battery of modern geological and archaeological dating techniques. And when researchers have pushed for that kind of rigorous scientific examination, they have consistently encountered obstacles. That is one of the things that keeps this mystery alive. Not just the carvings themselves, but the resistance to properly investigating them. Consider what has happened at other sites around Australia, where evidence has emerged that challenges the conventional timeline of the continent's history. The Gympie Pyramid in Queensland, a terraced stone structure discovered in the 1970s, was investigated briefly and then largely ignored. The Roman coins found on the shores of northern Australia, some of them authenticated as genuine ancient coins, have never received a proper archaeological investigation. The carved stones at Calandra, showing designs with striking similarities to Phoenician script, have been dismissed without serious study. There is a pattern here that anyone paying close attention will notice. A pattern of uncomfortable discoveries being met not with rigorous investigation, but with rapid dismissal followed by institutional silence. This does not prove that any of these sites represent genuine ancient contact, but it does suggest that the way archaeological claims in Australia are handled is sometimes shaped more by what conclusions are acceptable than by what the evidence actually demands, and that should make anyone committed to finding the truth slightly uncomfortable. The academic who has probably done the most serious work on the Kariong site is Dr. Hans-Dieter von Senf, a German researcher who spent years documenting the glyphs and attempting to place them within the context of ancient Egyptian maritime history. His work is careful, detailed, and largely ignored by mainstream Egyptology, which says something about the sociology of academic knowledge, even if it says nothing definitive about the carvings themselves. What von Senf found, working from detailed photographs and tracings of the site, was not a collection of random hieroglyphic-looking shapes. What he found was a text, a structured sequence of symbols following grammatical rules consistent with the specific period of ancient Egyptian writing, roughly the Old Kingdom period, predating the more familiar Middle and New Kingdom forms that most people think of when they picture hieroglyphics. The Old Kingdom hieroglyphs from the 4th and 5th dynasties have a slightly different character set, slightly different conventions for certain signs, and slightly different ways of indicating grammatical relationships. And the Kariong symbols in von Senf's analysis are consistent with those specific conventions. This is a remarkable claim. If it is accurate, it demolishes the hoax hypothesis almost completely, because a hoaxer working from 19th century reference books would have had access primarily to Middle and New Kingdom examples, which are the ones most thoroughly documented in the Egyptological literature of that era. Getting the Old Kingdom details right by accident would require either an extraordinary stroke of luck or a level of specialized knowledge that was not available to most people, specialists included, until quite recently. Ray Johnson's translation of the site, which aligns with von Senf's dating, describes the following story. A group of Egyptian sailors arrived in a foreign land after a long and difficult sea voyage. Among them was a prince, a royal son named Nefertiru. The prince fell ill in this strange country and died. The sailors, far from home, with no way to return his body to Egypt for proper burial according to the rituals they believed necessary for the soul's journey into the afterlife, buried him in the ground of this unknown land and carved their grief into the wall of the valley where he lay. There is a tomb entrance sealed with a stone at the base of one of the carved walls. It was discovered by researchers working at the site. No one has officially excavated it. The site is not on the protected list of heritage sites in New South Wales in a way that would prompt automatic investigation. It sits in a national park where rock art is protected from damage but not necessarily subject to active research. That sealed tomb, more than anything else, is the thing that keeps pulling serious people back to this site. Because if there is something inside it, if there are bones or artifacts or grave goods from a culture that should not be there, the implications are too large to comfortably contemplate. And if there is nothing inside it, or if it is a natural rock formation rather than a constructed burial, that would be significant information too. The kind of information that a real investigation should want to have. The fact that nobody with official authority has opened it speaks volumes, though exactly what volumes it speaks is a question each person has to answer for themselves. Let us drift now into the deeper waters of what we know about ancient Egyptian maritime capability, because this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, quite apart from the question of whether the Kariong site is authentic. The Egyptians documented their long-distance voyages more thoroughly than almost any other ancient civilization. The expedition to Punt is recorded in several locations, most elaborately in the reliefs at the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, which date from around 1500 years before the Common Era. The images show Egyptian ships loading cargo at a tropical port, the trees of Punt rising in the background. The inhabitants of Punt shown with distinct physical characteristics, suggesting they were not Africans from the immediate neighborhood of Egypt. Quantities of myrrh trees were brought back living in pots. Gold and ivory and animal skins were loaded onto the ships. The scale of the operation suggests it was not an unusual journey, but a regular trade route that had been established over long periods of time. The Red Sea, however, is not the Indian Ocean. Getting from the Red Sea to Australia would require passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait into the Gulf of Aden, then navigating south and east across the Indian Ocean. This is a journey of enormous distance, but it is not a journey without precedent in ancient history. There is solid evidence that the Indian Ocean trade network was active much earlier than conventional Western history tends to acknowledge. Indonesian sailors were regularly crossing the Indian Ocean to trade with the East African coast at a time when ancient Egypt was still building its greatest monuments. Genetic research published within the last decade has established definitively that people from Indonesia or the broader maritime Southeast Asian world were present in Madagascar roughly 1200 years ago, having crossed the Indian Ocean in traditional outrigger vessels. The Indian Ocean, in other words, was a highway, not a barrier, for ancient maritime cultures. Australia sits at the southeastern corner of the Indian Ocean world. It is not as remote from that network as it appears on a modern map. The northwest coast of Australia is actually relatively close to the islands of Indonesia, and there is documented evidence of regular contact between Aboriginal Australians and Macassan traders from Sulawesi that predates European contact by centuries. The Macassans came in wooden proas, traditional sailing vessels, following the monsoon winds south to Australia's northern coast every year to harvest sea cucumbers. They left behind traces in Aboriginal language, in genetic signatures, in oral traditions, in the remains of their campsites. If Macassan traders from Sulawesi were making this journey regularly in relatively simple wooden vessels following established wind patterns, the idea that ancient mariners from further west could have reached Australia by following the same basic framework of Indian Ocean winds and currents is not inherently absurd. It requires a source of motivation, which an exploratory expedition seeking trade or resources would provide. It requires navigational capability, which ancient maritime cultures demonstrably possessed. And it requires either a return journey, which would have been very difficult, or a reason to stay or to record the journey before the survivors eventually perished, which the inscription at Kariong, if genuine, represents. The monsoon system of the Indian Ocean is the key to understanding how ancient long-distance voyaging worked. The monsoon winds blow northeast from roughly October to April, and then reverse, blowing southwest from May to September. Ancient sailors who understood this system could ride the northeast monsoon from the Arabian Gulf and the Red Sea south and east, reaching the west coast of India, then the coast of Southeast Asia, and ultimately the waters northwest of Australia. The return voyage would be made on the southwest monsoon. Egyptian sailors who made regular trips to Pont would have had direct experience with Red Sea wind patterns and may have acquired knowledge of the wider system from the long-distance traders they encountered. This is not a proven route, it is a plausible one. And plausibility matters when we are dealing with a piece of evidence that the standard account cannot explain. Because here is the thing that is easy to lose sight of in all the argument about whether the Kariong Hieroglyphs are authentic or hoaxed. The argument is asymmetrical. If the glyphs are a hoax, it is a curiosity and a cautionary tale about how enthusiastic amateurs can mislead themselves and others. If the glyphs are genuine, they rewrite the history of human contact with Australia and require a fundamental revision of what we know about ancient maritime capability. The potential reward for taking the evidence seriously is enormous. The potential reward for dismissing it without proper investigation is nothing except the comfort of not having to revise anything. Institutional science has a strong bias towards the comfort of existing frameworks. This is not a conspiracy, it is a sociology. Thomas Kuhn wrote about it at length in his landmark work on the structure of scientific revolutions, describing how anomalous data tends to be explained away or ignored until it accumulates to the point where the existing framework can no longer contain it and a paradigm shift becomes inevitable. The history of science is full of discoveries that were dismissed or ridiculed for decades before they were accepted. Continental drift, the germ theory of disease, the idea that meteorites come from space. Each of these was once considered fringe thinking, the province of cranks and obsessives. Each of them turned out to be correct. None of that proves that the Kariong hieroglyphs are authentic. But it should encourage us to approach the question with genuine intellectual humility rather than reflexive dismissal. There is something deeply human about the mystery of this place. Standing in that sandstone corridor in the New South Wales bush, surrounded by eucalyptus trees and the dry smell of Australian summer, looking at symbols that seem to have no business being there, you feel a particular quality of vertigo that comes from encountering something that should be impossible but appears to be real. The experience forces you to hold two things simultaneously: the weight of what you can see in front of you and the weight of everything you have been taught about how the world works. Most of the time, we do not have to hold those two things in tension. Most of the time, the world cooperates with our expectations of it, but sometimes it does not. And the places where it refuses to cooperate are the most interesting places on Earth. Let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to ancient Egypt itself, to the civilization that supposedly left these marks on an Australian cliff face, and think about what it was and what it was capable of and what it might have wanted to find at the far end of the world. Egypt during the Old Kingdom period, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, was one of the most extraordinary human experiments ever conducted. In the river valley of the Nile, which runs like a green ribbon through an ocean of yellow desert, a civilization had developed that was simultaneously practical and mystical, administratively sophisticated and spiritually obsessed, capable of engineering achievements that still command astonishment, and also capable of believing with total sincerity that the king was a living god and that the correct positioning of a body in a tomb could determine the quality of its existence in the next world. The Old Kingdom is the age of the Great Pyramids, the Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built around 4,600 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing, built roughly 4,500 years ago. The Sphinx gazing across the desert with an expression that has been variously described as serene, enigmatic, melancholy, and knowing, depending on the quality of light and the mood of the observer. These were not primitive achievements. They required sophisticated mathematics, large-scale project management, advanced knowledge of materials and engineering, and a social organization capable of sustaining enormous long-term projects across multiple generations. The people who built these things were not simple. They were extraordinarily complex, curious, ambitious, and technically capable. They believed the world was larger than their immediate experience of it, and they were motivated both by practical need and by religious imperative to explore its edges. The Egyptians believed in a cosmic order called Ma'at, a concept that encompassed truth, justice, balance, and harmony, and they believed that the pharaoh's role was to maintain this order, to push back chaos and extend the domain of civilized life. Exploration and trade were part of this project. Finding new sources of the materials that sustained Egyptian life, the gold and the incense and the exotic woods and the precious stones, was not merely economic ambition, but a form of devotion to the order of the universe. Against this backdrop, the idea of an expedition venturing into unknown waters in search of whatever lay at the end of the world does not seem like fantasy. It seems like exactly the kind of thing the Old Kingdom pharaohs would have attempted if they had any reason to believe such a journey was possible. And there is one more thing about ancient Egypt that is worth understanding before we go any further. The Egyptians were not just sailors and builders, they were also meticulous record keepers. They wrote everything down: administrative records, religious texts, love poetry, medical treatises, astronomical observations, the accounts of battles and trade expeditions. They carved text into temple walls and painted it onto tomb ceilings, and pressed it into papyrus with reed brushes dipped in carbon ink. The survival rate of these records, given that many of them are 4,000 and 5,000 years old, is remarkable, largely a function of Egypt's extremely dry climate, which is one of the great preserving environments on Earth, but not everything was preserved, not even close. The ancient library at Alexandria, which scholars believe held hundreds of thousands of scrolls representing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, was destroyed probably more than once over the course of several centuries. The temple archives of Memphis and Thebes and Heliopolis were sacked and burned repeatedly as conquerors moved through the Nile Valley over the millennia. The administrative records of the Old Kingdom are far less complete than those of the later New Kingdom, partly because the Old Kingdom ended in a period of collapse and fragmentation, during which many documents were lost or destroyed. The absence of an Egyptian record of a voyage to Australia is therefore genuinely ambiguous. It might mean the voyage never happened. It might mean the record existed and was lost. It might mean the expedition was so unusual and so unsuccessful. A royal prince dying far from home with no possibility of proper burial, that the records were deliberately suppressed because recording failure and loss was not something the Egyptian record-keeping system was particularly inclined to do. Egyptian monumental inscriptions tend to record victories and achievements. Defeats and disasters tend to be either reframed as victories or simply not mentioned. Now, let us talk about what Ray Johnson actually found when he translated the site, because the story the glyphs supposedly tell is, regardless of your position on their authenticity, a genuinely moving piece of narrative. Johnson's translation, which he published in a self-funded volume and which has been both celebrated by alternative history researchers and largely ignored by mainstream Egyptology, reads something like this. An expedition set out from Egypt during the reign of a pharaoh whose name includes references to Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, though the exact identification has been disputed. The expedition was led by or included a royal prince, a son of the pharaoh whose name is given as Nefertiru. This name is a legitimate Egyptian construction, meaning something along the lines of beautiful in the fashion of Ra, the sun god, and is consistent with the naming conventions of the Old Kingdom period. The expedition sailed south from Egypt through the Red Sea and into waters that were not charted by any map the sailors had available to them. They followed winds and stars and the migrations of birds, the ancient navigator's compass. They reached a land that was vast and strange and unlike anything described in any Egyptian text they had ever read. They went ashore, they explored, and then the prince became ill. The illness is not described in detail, at least not in ways that Johnson's translation can recover clearly from the damaged and weathered symbols. But the prince died, and this is where the inscription takes on its most emotionally powerful character, because what follows in Johnson's translation is a description of grief. Sailors far from home, unable to perform the elaborate burial rituals that Egyptian belief required for the safe passage of the soul into the afterlife, did their best with what they had. They found a place that felt right, a sheltered valley between two walls of sandstone, with the sound of water nearby and the shade of unfamiliar trees. They buried the prince. They sealed his tomb with a stone. And then they carved into the walls of his resting place everything they knew how to say about who he was and where he came from and what had been lost. That sealed entrance at the base of the carved wall is not a metaphor. It is not a symbolic gesture. If the translation is accurate, it is the actual burial place of an Egyptian prince who died in Australia somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. The emotional weight of that possibility is difficult to fully absorb. Think about what it would mean. Think about those sailors crossing an ocean they had no map for, watching one of their own die in a country with no name in any language they knew, trying to do right by him in a world that offered them none of the resources their religion required. No priests, no proper embalming, no canopic jars, no Ushabti figurines to serve him in the next world. Just sandstone and the tools they had and the writing they had learned as children on the banks of the Nile. They carved his story into the rock, they sealed his tomb, and then, presumably, they left. Whether they made it home is unknown. Whether anyone in Egypt ever learned what had happened to the prince is unknown. Whether the expedition was ever recorded in any document that has since been lost is unknown. All that remains, if we accept the evidence at face value, is this corridor of stone in the New South Wales bush, and the hieroglyphs pressed into its walls by hands that held their tools in grief. There is something about this story that resonates in a way that purely fictional narratives rarely achieve. The specificity of it, the grief of it, the way it maps onto the universal human experience of losing someone far from home and having inadequate resources to honor the loss properly. This is not the triumphant narrative of conquest and discovery that ancient inscriptions usually tell. This is a document of failure and mourning, which, paradoxically, makes it feel more human and more credible than any inscription celebrating victory would. Whether it is true or not, it is a story that deserves to be told. But we have not yet talked about the most striking visual element of the site, the one that appears in nearly every photograph taken there, and that has proved the most difficult for skeptics to explain away. Among the symbols carved into the sandstone at Kariong is a figure that appears to show a creature unlike any animal native to Australia. It has a long neck. It has flippers rather than feet. Its body is streamlined in the manner of an aquatic animal. It looks with an uncanny specificity that has fascinated researchers for decades, like a depiction of a long-necked plesiosaur, the marine reptile that went extinct approximately 66 million years ago, along with the non-avian dinosaurs. Now, this is where the story gets genuinely strange, even by the standards of what we have already covered. The plesiosaur carving at Kariong is not the only ancient depiction of what appears to be a marine reptile in Australian art and tradition. Aboriginal traditions from various parts of Australia include references to a large water creature called by different names in different regions, a creature described as inhabiting rivers and waterholes and occasionally the sea, with a long neck and a large body and behavior that would be consistent with a large predatory animal. The bunyip of southeastern Australian Aboriginal tradition is sometimes described in ways that, if you are being imaginative, could suggest an animal similar to a plesiosaur. Various cattle stations in remote parts of Queensland and Western Australia have, over the decades, produced reports from Aboriginal stockmen and their descendants of encounters with large, unidentified animals in remote waterways. None of this constitutes evidence for the survival of plesiosaurs into the modern era. The idea is almost certainly wrong, and it belongs firmly in the category of cryptozoology rather than serious paleontology. But it adds a layer of strangeness to the Kariong site that is difficult to account for cleanly. Because if Egyptian sailors were carving symbols at this site, and if among those symbols is a creature that looks like an animal that has been extinct for 66 million years, where does that image come from? Did the Egyptian sailors encounter an aboriginal tradition about a mysterious water creature and record what they were told? Did they see something in Australian waters that they could not identify and attempt to depict it in stone? Or is the plesiosaur identification simply a case of pattern recognition applied too enthusiastically to an ambiguous image? Each of these possibilities is interesting in its own right. None of them resolves the question cleanly. The Kariong site does not stand alone. This is another thing that is important to understand. It is not a single anomalous carving in an otherwise unremarkable landscape. It sits within a broader context of unusual archaeological discoveries in Australia that, taken together, suggest a more complex pre-European history for the continent than mainstream history currently acknowledges. Let us move east along the coast a little and talk about something that happened in 1910 on the shore of what is now called the Balmain Peninsula in Sydney. A local fisherman digging in the earth near the waterfront unearthed a collection of small objects made of terracotta, clay fired in a kiln, bearing markings that were later identified by a visiting scholar as Phoenician script. The Phoenicians were the great maritime traders of the ancient world, the people who sailed from their home ports on the coast of modern Lebanon to every corner of the Mediterranean and, according to Herodotus, who was sometimes unreliable but sometimes extraordinarily accurate, all the way around the African continent. If Phoenician traders were at the eastern coast of Australia in the early centuries of the first millennium before the Common Era, they would have arrived via a route completely different from any that conventional history describes. They would have had to cross the Indian Ocean, navigate through the waters of Southeast Asia, and reach the eastern seaboard of a continent that European explorers would not reach for another 2,000 years. The terracotta objects from Balmain were examined, argued over, and then quietly forgotten. They have not been definitively authenticated. They have not been definitively debunked. They sit in the same uncomfortable middle ground that the Kariong Hieroglyphs occupy. Too anomalous to ignore, too inconvenient to properly investigate. Further north, in Queensland, there is the question of the Gympie Pyramid, which we mentioned briefly, but which deserves more attention. The terraced stone structure at Gympie, discovered in the 1970s by a farmer named Dal Berry, who uncovered it while clearing land for agriculture, has been variously interpreted as a natural geological formation, an aboriginal earthwork of uncertain purpose, and a genuine human-constructed pyramid consistent with the architectural traditions of pre-Columbian South America or ancient Southeast Asia. Artifacts found near the site included a carved stone figure that has been compared to Vedic Hindu statuary, an iron smelting furnace inconsistent with any known Aboriginal technology, and fragments of pottery that have not been matched to any known Australian Aboriginal ceramic tradition. The Gympie site was briefly examined by archaeologists in the 1970s, declared to be a natural formation, and dismissed. The farmer who discovered it maintained until his death that the dismissal was cursory and politically motivated, that the investigators spent less time at the site than would be required for any serious geological assessment, and that their conclusion was reached before rather than after their examination. His account was ignored. The site has since been significantly disturbed by construction activity, making future investigation difficult. This pattern, repeated discovery, cursory dismissal, subsequent disturbance or destruction, applies to a remarkable number of potentially significant archaeological sites across Australia. Part of this is straightforwardly a resource problem. Australia is an enormous country with a tiny archaeological research budget relative to the size and complexity of its landscape. There are simply not enough trained archaeologists to properly investigate every unusual discovery. Sites get passed over not because of conspiracy, but because of simple shortage of time and money and personnel. But part of it is also a disciplinary bias, a tendency among professional archaeologists to operate within a framework that assumes Australia's pre-European history was essentially isolated from the rest of the world, punctuated only by the original settlement from Southeast Asia, roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, and the subsequent development of Aboriginal culture in relative isolation. Within that framework, any discovery suggesting earlier or more complex contact is not merely surprising. It is threatening because it requires not just adding a data point, but restructuring the entire model. And restructuring entire models is uncomfortable work that most people, including scientists, prefer to avoid. The bias is understandable. It is also corrosive to genuine inquiry. Let us talk about the geology of the Kariong site for a moment, because the physical characteristics of the rock where the glyphs are carved matter enormously to the question of when they were made. The sandstone of the central coast of New South Wales is a sedimentary rock laid down during the Triassic period, roughly 250 million years ago. It is a fine-grained, relatively hard rock that weathers slowly under normal conditions, but can be significantly affected by chemical weathering from water and biological agents like lichen and mosses. The Kariong site sits in a sheltered corridor that is shaded for much of the day, which would significantly slow mechanical weathering from temperature cycling, and which would tend to channel water along the base of the walls rather than across the carved surfaces, reducing but not eliminating chemical weathering. Carvings made into this kind of rock in a sheltered position could maintain their visual sharpness for much longer than carvings exposed to full weather. This complicates the argument that the relative sharpness of some of the Kariong symbols indicates modern origin. A carving made 3,000 years ago in a sheltered sandstone corridor in coastal New South Wales might look very similar to one made 150 years ago. The visual appearance alone cannot resolve the question. What could potentially resolve it is a process called optically stimulated luminescence dating, or OSL. This technique measures the time elapsed since mineral grains in a rock surface were last exposed to light. When rock is carved, the fresh surface exposed by the carving tool begins accumulating a luminescent signal that can later be measured and converted to an age estimate. OSL dating has been successfully applied to rock carvings in other parts of the world and has produced reliable age estimates for surfaces ranging from a few hundred to hundreds of thousands of years old. No OSL dating has ever been performed in the Kariong carvings. The question of why not is one that the people who care about this site have been asking for decades. The honest answer is probably a combination of factors. The site has not been formally recognized as archaeologically significant, which means it has not attracted the funding that would be required for scientific dating programs. Professional archaeologists who might have the expertise and resources to conduct such dating tend to operate within the institutional framework that predisposes them to dismiss the site. And dismissing it means they have no professional incentive to invest time and resources in dating it. The people most motivated to have the dating done are amateur researchers and independent investigators who do not have access to the equipment and laboratory facilities required. It is a frustrating situation that ultimately disserves everyone, including the people who are confident the site is a hoax and would presumably like to have that hoax definitively and scientifically established so that the matter could finally be put to rest. A definitive dating result, whether it came back consistent with ancient origin or consistent with 19th or 20th century origin, would serve the truth regardless of which direction it pointed. The fact that the definitive dating has never been done is the central institutional failure in the story of the Kariong Hieroglyphs, and it is a failure that belongs equally to believers and skeptics. Meanwhile, the stone walls of the Kariong Valley continue to hold whatever they hold. The symbols cut into them by hands unknown continue to weather at whatever rate the sheltered sandstone allows. The sealed tomb entrance at the base of the carved wall continues to be sealed, its contents unknown, its history undiscovered. The eucalyptus trees drop their bark and their leaves. The currawongs call to each other in the morning. The wind moves through the corridor and rearranges the light across the hieroglyphs in ways that make some of them easier to read and others harder, depending on the hour. The valley does not care about the argument. It simply continues to be what it is, which may be one of the most remarkable places in Australia, or maybe the most elaborate piece of outsider art ever produced in the Australian bush, or maybe something in between those possibilities that no one has yet found the language to describe accurately. And that ambiguity is not a failure, it is an invitation. Let us consider what it would mean, in practical terms, for an Egyptian expedition to have actually reached the coast of Australia during the Old Kingdom period, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a logistical one. What would the journey have looked like? What problems would the sailors have faced? What resources would they have needed? And what would have brought them to this specific place on the central coast of New South Wales, rather than any of the thousands of kilometres of other Australian coastline? The Old Kingdom Egyptians had access to two types of seagoing vessel. The first was built from cedar imported from Lebanon, which was traded through Byblos, the great timber port on the Phoenician coast. Cedar is an excellent shipbuilding timber, strong and relatively resistant to rot, and the Egyptians used it for their largest and most important ships. The second type was built from bundles of papyrus reed lashed together in the hull-up method, a construction technique that is enormously seaworthy when done correctly, and that has been demonstrated in modern times by explorer Thor Heyerdahl, who sailed a papyrus reed boat called Ra-2 across the Atlantic Ocean in 1970 to prove that such a vessel was capable of transoceanic navigation. Either type of vessel, under sail and with experienced navigation, could potentially have completed the voyage from the Red Sea to Australia, given enough time and adequate provisioning. The journey following the Indian Ocean monsoon routes might have taken somewhere between 3 and 6 months in each direction, depending on the season of departure and the specific route taken. This is a long time to be at sea by any standard, but it is not unprecedented in ancient maritime history. Polynesian voyagers were making journeys of comparable duration across the Pacific. The early Portuguese explorers of the 15th century were making round trips to West Africa of similar length in vessels no more sophisticated than what ancient Egyptians had available. The provisioning challenge would have been significant but not insurmountable. Egyptian ships making the voyage to Punt would have carried dried goods, including grain and dried fish and dates and other preserved foods that could sustain a crew for weeks. Water would have been the more serious constraint, and experienced navigators would have known how to find freshwater sources by reading the color and movement of coastal waters and by following birds toward land. The central coast of New South Wales has numerous rivers and estuaries that discharge into the Tasman Sea, providing abundant fresh water close to shore. If a large Egyptian vessel reached the coast of New South Wales, its crew would have found a landscape radically unlike anything in their experience. The Australian coast from the Central Coast region presents a dramatic interface of bush-covered headlands falling into blue ocean, white sand beaches, river mouths fringed with mangroves, and the distinctive pale trunks of eucalyptus trees rising from reddish soil. To sailors accustomed to the flat, pale desert landscape of Egypt and the relatively short, scrubby vegetation of the Red Sea coast, the heightened density of the Australian bush would have been extraordinary. The animals would have been unlike anything they had seen or heard of. Kangaroos, wombats, koalas sitting motionless in tree forks, kookaburras laughing from branches above them, echidnas shuffling through leaf litter, cassowaries if they ventured far enough north. The world would have seemed entirely remade, and the Aboriginal people of the Central Coast would have been there, watching these strange visitors with their painted ships and their unfamiliar tools and their skin unlike any skin they had seen before. Whether contact between the Egyptians and the local Aboriginal people was friendly, cautious, or hostile, we cannot know. Whether they traded, communicated through gesture, or simply regarded each other across an unbridgeable distance of mutual incomprehension, we cannot know, but they would have been aware of each other. The central coast of New South Wales was, 4,500 years ago, as now, a landscape thick with human presence. The Aboriginal people of this region had been here for tens of thousands of years and knew every fold of its terrain, every seasonal movement of its animals, every rhythm of its weather. The valley at Kariong, with its sheltered sandstone walls and its access to water, would have been an obvious place to make camp. It offers shade in the Australian summer, protection from wind, proximity to drinking water from the natural drainage of the surrounding hills, and a degree of shelter from the ocean weather that can be severe on the Central Coast. If you were a group of exhausted sailors who had just completed a journey of months across waters they had no chart for, arriving on the shores of a continent whose existence they may not have known before they set out, you might well choose a place like this to rest and recover and grieve. You might carve things into the walls of the valley while you were there. You might carve them with the same compulsive need to record and to witness that drives human beings to scratch their names into desks and trees, and the walls of prison cells and the surface of distant planets. We were here, we passed through, we suffered this loss in this place. Remember us. The urge to leave a mark is as old as human consciousness. It may be older. It certainly predates the invention of formal writing systems, since the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira and Sulawesi show us that our ancestors were making marks meant to communicate and to persist long before anyone had worked out a system for encoding language in visual symbols. The Egyptians, who had one of the most sophisticated writing systems of the ancient world, would have expressed this urge with the tools of their culture, which meant hieroglyphs. And the hieroglyphs, if they are real, are still there. There is an Aboriginal elder whose name I will not use here because she has not sought public attention, who grew up on the Central Coast and who has, in various conversations recorded by researchers over the years, described an oral tradition in her community about the valley at Kariong. The tradition, as she related, describes strangers arriving from the sea at some point in the far past, strangers who were sick and frightened and who made markings on the stone walls of a valley in the bush before disappearing. The tradition does not specify where the strangers came from. It does not describe their physical appearance in detail. It remembers the event as a strange and unusual thing, not a regular occurrence, not a trade relationship, but a single episode of contact that was preserved in the community's memory because of its unusual character. I want to be careful here because it is very easy to take fragments of oral tradition out of context and weave them into a narrative that fits a pre-existing theory. Aboriginal oral traditions are complex, multi-layered, and often encode information in ways that are not immediately apparent to outsiders. The tradition about strangers in the valley at Kariong might be a memory of ancient contact. It might be a memory of more recent European explorers. It might be a teaching story that was never intended as literal history. Without access to the full context of the tradition, and without the guidance of the elders who hold it in its complete form, it would be irresponsible to treat it as definitive evidence of anything. What it is a thread worth following carefully with respect and patience in the hope that it might lead somewhere. The question of what Aboriginal Australians knew and know about the deep history of their continent is one that Australian archaeology has only very recently begun to take seriously. For most of the history of European settlement, Aboriginal knowledge was either ignored entirely or treated as folklore with no reliable historical content. The idea that oral traditions could preserve accurate historical information across thousands of years was dismissed as impossible by scholars who had no experience of how oral traditions actually work and what they are capable of preserving. Recent research has changed this significantly. A 2020 study published in the journal Geology demonstrated that Aboriginal oral traditions from coastal regions of Australia preserve accurate geographical information about sea level changes that occurred thousands of years ago, at the end of the last ice age. The traditions describe landscapes, including lakes and valleys and coastlines, that were submerged when sea levels rose after the ice melted. The geographical details in the traditions match the actual submerged topography of the continental shelf, which has been mapped using modern sonar technology. The accuracy of the traditions in some cases spans more than 7,000 years, an astonishing testament to the fidelity with which oral traditions can preserve detailed factual information across enormous periods of time. If Aboriginal oral traditions can accurately preserve information about geographical events from 7,000 years ago, they can certainly preserve information about unusual visitors from 4,000 years ago. The question is not whether such preservation is possible. The question is how to access and interpret that preserved information in ways that respect both its integrity and its complexity. This is painstaking work. It cannot be done by outsiders operating without permission and without the guidance of the communities whose traditions they are attempting to study. It requires the kind of long-term, trust-based collaborative relationship between researchers and Aboriginal communities that takes years to develop and that has not yet been fully established for most sites in Australia. In the meantime, the stone walls of Kariong hold their silence, and the sealed tomb at their base holds whatever it holds. And the question of who carved the hieroglyphs and when and what they meant remains infuriatingly and fascinatingly open. Let us follow the thread of ancient Egyptian maritime history a little further, because there are several pieces of evidence from outside Australia that are relevant to the question of how far Egyptian or Egyptian-affiliated mariners may have ranged during the Bronze Age. The first and most striking is cocaine and tobacco in Egyptian mummies. This is not a fringe claim. It is documented in peer-reviewed scientific literature. In 1992, a German toxicologist named Svetlana Balabanova published the results of chemical analysis she had performed on the hair, skin, and soft tissue of 9 Egyptian mummies in the collection of the Munich Museum. The mummies dated from the New Kingdom period, roughly 3,000 years ago. The analysis detected the presence of cocaine and nicotine in every one of the 9 samples. This result caused immediate controversy because cocaine is derived from the coca plant, which is native to South America, and nicotine in sufficient concentration for reliable detection is found primarily in tobacco, which is also native to the Americas. In 1992, the prevailing scientific view was that no contact between the Old World and the Americas had occurred before Columbus's voyage in 1492. The presence of cocaine and nicotine in Egyptian mummies therefore seemed not merely surprising but impossible. Balabanova's methodology was challenged extensively. The possibility of contamination was raised. Alternative plant sources for cocaine-like alkaloids in the Old World were proposed, though none of them were shown to produce the same compound in comparable quantities. The specific cocaine molecule detected is not produced in meaningful amounts by any Old World plant source currently identified. The study has been replicated. Subsequent analyses of mummies from other collections, using different testing methodologies to rule out contamination, have confirmed the original findings. The cocaine and nicotine are there. They were there in the bodies of people who lived and died 3,000 years ago in Egypt. The conventional explanation for how they got there does not exist, because the conventional explanation would require a level of pre-Columbian contact with the Americas that mainstream history does not acknowledge. One possible explanation is that Egyptian traders maintained contact with cultures in the Americas through intermediaries, either Pacific navigators or other maritime cultures now lost to history, through a chain of exchanges that eventually brought American plants to the Egyptian luxury market. Another possible explanation is that Egyptian ships, or ships carrying Egyptian goods, reached the Americas directly during the New Kingdom period. Neither of these explanations is comfortable for mainstream history. Both of them are, strictly speaking, consistent with the available evidence. The cocaine mummies do not prove that ancient Egyptians were in Australia, but they establish beyond any reasonable doubt that some kind of contact between ancient Egypt and the Americas was occurring during the Bronze Age, contact that the current historical framework does not account for and cannot explain. And if the historical framework is wrong about Egyptian contact with the Americas, it might also be wrong about Egyptian contact with Australia. The Bronze Age world was connected in ways that history textbooks still tend to underrepresent. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 years before the Common Era, an event that destroyed or severely damaged the Mycenaean Greek culture, the Hittite Empire, the kingdoms of the Levant, and caused a significant disruption to Egypt itself, was the result of a cascade of interconnected failures across a trading network that spanned, at minimum, the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The clay tablets found at Ugarit in Syria, which represent the last administrative records of that city before it was destroyed in the Bronze Age collapse, show a trading city in contact with sources of goods from across the known world. The collapse of this network was a civilizational catastrophe that set human progress back by centuries in the affected regions. But the network existed, and it was larger than the textbook suggests. And the question of how large is one that archaeologists and historians are still actively investigating. The Kariong Hieroglyphs sit at one possible edge of that network. They may represent the furthest reach of Old Kingdom Egyptian maritime exploration, a voyage so far beyond the known world that it ended in loss and grief and a wall of carved stone in the Australian bush. Or they may be something else entirely, a very elaborate hoax, a misidentified natural formation, a genuine Aboriginal adaptation of observed Egyptian writing brought to Australia through intermediaries in a chain of contact we have not yet traced. The honest answer is that we do not know, and the honest response to not knowing is to investigate rather than to assume. The valley at Kariong is waiting, the stone is patient. The symbols cut into it by hands unknown continue to weather at whatever rate the geology allows. And somewhere beneath the sealed stone at the base of the carved wall, in darkness that has been unbroken for however many years since the stone was placed, lies whatever lies there. That is the mystery. It is a real one. It deserves real attention. There are people who visit the Kariong site regularly, people who have been going there for years, sometimes decades, who know the valley in the way that you can only know a place when you have returned to it in every season and every quality of light. They have watched the shadows shift across the symbols in the morning. They have sat in the corridor during rain and listened to the sound change when water runs down the sandstone walls. They have photographed the same carvings hundreds of times at different times of day and found that the variations in lighting reveal different details, that symbols which seem simple in flat midday light reveal depth and intentionality in the long slanted beams of late afternoon. These people are not credulous or simple. Most of them have spent considerable time studying Egyptology and ancient history and geology and archaeology, not because they had professional training in these fields, but because they were drawn by this particular mystery and pursued it with the seriousness it deserves. Some of them have corresponded with Egyptologists. Some of them have consulted geologists about the weathering characteristics of the site. Some of them have tracked down every academic paper ever written about the question of ancient contact with Australia and read them with care. What they consistently describe is not the experience of true believers, not the experience of people who arrived at the site with a conclusion already formed and looked for evidence to support it. What they describe is the experience of people who arrived with an open question and found that the site consistently refuses to resolve itself into either a clean hoax or a clean confirmation. The symbols are too good to dismiss easily. The weathering is too ambiguous to date confidently. The context is too rich, too layered, too connected to too many other anomalies across the continent to feel like a simple prank by a bored enthusiast. One researcher, a retired school teacher from the Central Coast who has spent 30 years investigating the site, described his experience this way. He said that when he first heard about the Kariong glyphs, he was certain they were a hoax. He went to the site for the first time, fully intending to spend half an hour there, satisfy himself that they were obviously modern carvings, and go home. He spent 8 hours there instead. He went back the following weekend. He has now visited the site over 200 times, and he is still not certain of what he's looking at. He has moved from confident dismissal through fascinated uncertainty and arrived somewhere that he describes as a deep respect for the unresolvable, a capacity to sit with a question that cannot yet be answered and not need it to be. That quality of intellectual patience is rarer than it should be. We live in a time that pushes hard for certainty, for clean conclusions, for things to be either definitively true or definitively false. The Kariong hieroglyphs resist this. They sit in the uncomfortable middle territory where the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and the honest response is to say so rather than to retreat to either side of the debate. And yet there are those who are certain. There are Egyptologists who have stated flatly that the site is a hoax and that no further investigation is warranted. There are alternative history researchers who are equally certain that the site is exactly what it appears to be, an ancient Egyptian inscription, and that the failure to investigate it properly is a coordinated institutional suppression of inconvenient truth. Both certainties are, in my view, intellectually premature. Both are driven more by prior commitment to a worldview than by the actual weight of the available evidence. The truth, as best as we can currently assess it, is somewhere in the genuinely uncertain middle. The symbols are real. The questions they raise are real. The absence of definitive investigation is real and troubling. The pattern of dismissal that has attended other potentially significant archaeological finds in Australia is real. The documented evidence for ancient long-distance maritime capability that reaches further than standard history acknowledges is real. The cocaine and nicotine in the Egyptian mummies is real. None of this proves that ancient Egyptians were in Australia. It establishes that the question is worth taking seriously, and that the dismissal of that question has been more reflexive than rigorous. Now, let us talk about a completely different angle on this story, because the Kariong hieroglyphs are not the only thing at this site that demands explanation, and focusing exclusively on the Egyptian angle risks missing something equally strange. Within a short distance of the main carved walls, researchers have documented a series of other unusual features in the landscape that have not been adequately explained by any framework, hoax, or genuine ancient contact. There is a shallow depression in the sandstone floor of the valley that, when examined closely, appears to be artificially shaped, its edges too regular to be entirely natural. There are several vertical holes bored into the rock that appear to have been made with a rotary drilling tool, the kind of tool that requires both a drill bit and sustained rotary force, and that would not be a natural feature of sandstone geology. There are what appear to be deliberately placed flat stones at intervals along the valley floor that form a pattern too regular to be coincidental. These features could be the work of the same people who carved the hieroglyphs, ancient or modern. They could be the work of Aboriginal people using the site for purposes that were not related to the Egyptian-style carvings. They could be natural features that only appear worked because the human pattern recognition system is extraordinarily good at finding intention in the world, even when none is present. The honest response is the same one we have been giving throughout this story. We do not know. Proper investigation would help. No proper investigation has been done. What is clear is that the Kariong Valley was used as a significant site by someone at some point. The concentration of unusual features, the hieroglyphs, the potential tomb entrance, the other structural features suggests purposeful activity, a decision to invest significant time and effort in this particular location. Whether that activity was ancient Egyptian, Aboriginal, early European settler, 19th century enthusiast, or some combination of more than one of these, the site carries the weight of human intention. And human intention, once pressed into stone, has a remarkable persistence. The marks we make tend to outlast us by orders of magnitude. The handprints on the walls of the Chauvet cave in southern France were made 32,000 years ago and are still there, still communicating something across an almost incomprehensible gulf of time. The cuneiform tablets of ancient Mesopotamia have survived 4,000 years and been deciphered by 20th century scholars who could not have imagined while alive that any record of their civilization would endure. The hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt, which were a completely dead and unreadable script from the 4th century of Common Era until Jean-François Champollion cracked the Rosetta Stone in 1822, spent 1400 years waiting for someone who could read them again. Whatever is on the walls at Kariong is waiting too, for proper equipment, for proper expertise, for the political and institutional will to ask the question seriously. The Aboriginal people of the Central Coast have been waiting rather longer for the academic establishment to take their heritage seriously. This is a point worth making clearly. The narrative around the Kariong hieroglyphs tends to center on the question of Egyptian contact. And in centering on that question, it sometimes inadvertently sidelines the 40,000-year Aboriginal presence on this land that is not in question at all. The Aboriginal history of the Central Coast is extraordinary and richly documented in the landscape, in surviving oral traditions, in the genuine Aboriginal rock art that covers sandstone faces throughout the region. That history does not need the Egyptian glyphs to be real or false in order to be important. It is important regardless. What the Kariong story adds to the Aboriginal history of the region, if the site is genuine, is not a diminishment of that history, but a complication. Not a replacement of the Aboriginal narrative with a foreign one, but a suggestion that the deep history of Australia may have involved, at some point, a moment of contact between two extraordinary civilizations, contact that may have been brief and painful and productive of grief rather than exchange, but contact nonetheless. Human history is not a collection of separate sealed boxes. It is a web of connections that we are still tracing, connections that surprise us regularly because our understanding of ancient capability has consistently underestimated what people were able to do. We thought they could not cross the Pacific. They did. We thought they could not navigate the Indian Ocean. They did. We thought they could not have known about plants from a continent they had never visited. The mummies suggest otherwise. The question of whether ancient Egyptians reached Australia is one more thread in this web. It may connect, it may not. The honest answer, the only intellectually defensible answer, is that we do not yet know, and the investigation required to know it has not been done. The mystery lives in the gap between those two statements. It is late now, wherever you are. The light outside your window is whatever it is, city glow or stars, the orange wash of a street light or the deep black of a rural night. The sounds around you are settling into the particular sonic texture of your sleeping hours. And somewhere on the other side of the world, from wherever you are, in a sheltered sandstone valley north of Sydney, the hieroglyphs are sitting in darkness too. The scrub outside the valley is alive with the sounds of the Australian night. The southern boobook owl calling softly from the eucalyptus canopy, the rustle of a possum moving through the dry leaves, the distant sound of the ocean, which is always somewhere nearby on the central coast, moving in the darkness with its own massive patience. The stars above the valley are the southern hemisphere stars, the ones that ancient Egyptian sailors, if they ever arrived here, would have found bewildering and unfamiliar after a lifetime of navigating by the stars of the northern sky. The Southern Cross, which has been the navigational landmark for Aboriginal Australians for 40,000 years, would have been as alien to those hypothetical Egyptian sailors as the sight of a kangaroo. The idea of that. Standing on an Australian beach on an autumn night 4,000 years ago, looking up at a sky full of stars you have never seen, in a country whose name you do not know, and not knowing whether you will ever find your way home. That is one of the most achingly human situations I can imagine. It is the experience of being truly and completely lost, not just in space, but in the entire framework of the known world. Every map you had was wrong. Every star you navigated by was on the wrong side of the sky. Every plant and animal was wrong. Everything was new and strange, and the person you were responsible for was dead. And so you carved. You took whatever tool was available to you, probably a copper chisel of the kind used in Egypt for stonework at this period, and you pressed it into the sandstone that was so different from the limestone of the Nile Valley, and you wrote. You wrote in the only language you had, in the symbols that had been pressed into your mind since childhood, in the writing system that was as fundamental to your identity as the gods you prayed to. You wrote the name of the prince who had died. You wrote the name of the king he served. You wrote what you could of the grief and the distance and the impossibility of proper burial. And then you sealed the tomb and you left. Or perhaps you did not leave. Perhaps some of you stayed unable or unwilling to attempt the return voyage, choosing instead to remain in this strange land and live out whatever life remained to them among people whose language they could not speak and whose world they could not navigate. Perhaps there are genetic traces of those hypothetical Egyptian sailors in the DNA of Aboriginal families on the Central Coast, buried deep in the chromosomal record, waiting for someone to look for them with sufficient precision. The genetic study of Australian Aboriginal populations is still in its early stages. The Human Genome Project and the subsequent revolution in genetic analysis have made it possible, in principle, to detect very small contributions from distant populations in a modern genome. If even a handful of Egyptian sailors lived and died and had children on the Central Coast 4,000 years ago, those children would have had children, and their children would have had children, and over 150 generations, the Egyptian contribution to those genomes would have been diluted enormously, but might still, in principle, be detectable. The technology to look for it exists. The study has not been done. Everything about this story comes back to things that have not been done. Investigations that should have happened and have not. The geological dating, the tomb excavation, the genetic analysis, the careful, sustained, properly funded archaeological investigation of the site and its surrounding landscape, the collaborative research program with Aboriginal community members that would be required to properly contextualize the site within the broader history of the Central Coast. None of this is impossible. None of it is even particularly expensive in the scheme of things. The entire research program I'm describing would cost less than the annual budget of a small university department. The barrier is not resources. The barrier is will, institutional will, to take the question seriously enough to actually investigate it. Perhaps that will change. Perhaps the accumulating weight of anomalous evidence from across Australia, the cocaine mummies, the Gympie Pyramid, the Balmain terracotta, the Kariong hieroglyphs themselves, will eventually reach the threshold at which the institutional paradigm can no longer comfortably contain it and must shift. Perhaps a geneticist doing routine population studies will stumble across an unexpected signature in Central Coast Aboriginal genomes and begin asking questions. Perhaps a geologist examining the Central Coast sandstone for some entirely unrelated purpose will notice the carvings and think to apply modern dating techniques to them. Perhaps the sealed tomb entrance will be disturbed by erosion or by animal activity in a way that exposes something definitive. Or perhaps the valley will continue to sit in its particular silence for another generation, holding its ambiguity patiently, resisting resolution. Mysteries that resist resolution have a particular quality. They are uncomfortable because we are wired to seek closure, to resolve pattern into conclusion. But they are also generative because an open question keeps the mind active in a way that a closed one does not. The Kariong Hieroglyphs have been generating thought and investigation and argument for 50 years. They have sent people to libraries and archives and field sites. They have caused scholars of different disciplines to speak to each other across the usual walls of academic specialization. They have made a sandstone valley in New South Wales into a place of genuine intellectual significance. Whatever they ultimately prove to be, they have already done something valuable. They have reminded us that the story of human presence on this planet is stranger and larger and more connected than we usually allow ourselves to believe. They have pushed back against the comfortable certainty that we know who went where and when and why. They have held open a question that needed to be held open, and they will continue to hold it open, cut into patient Australian sandstone for as long as the rock lasts and the light finds them in the afternoon, which, given the age of Australian geology, might be a very long time indeed. Let us rest here for a moment in the particular stillness of this story before moving forward. There is a version of the Kariong mystery that rarely gets told, which is the version that focuses not on evidence and counter-evidence, not on the academic politics of archaeology, not on the question of what is or is not inscribed in the stone, but on the simpler and more human question of what it means to be remembered. Every civilization that has ever existed has struggled with the knowledge of its own mortality. Every culture that has ever developed writing has used that writing, among other things, to reach across time and speak to people not yet born. The Egyptian hieroglyphic system was not invented purely for administrative convenience. It was invented also as a tool of immortality, a way of preserving the name and the deeds and the identity of a person beyond the brief span of biological life. In Egyptian theology, as long as a person's name continued to be spoken, that person continued to exist in some form. The worst fate that could befall an Egyptian, worse than death itself, was to have their name erased, to have their memory obliterated, to pass out of existence entirely. This is why Egyptian monuments are so thoroughly inscribed. The great temple complexes, the tomb walls, the stelae set up at the boundaries of the kingdom, all carry names, repeated, carved deep, painted bright. The name is the anchor of existence in Egyptian thought, and the hieroglyphic system is the net in which the name is held. If Egyptian sailors died far from home and carved their story into a sandstone wall in Australia, the deepest motivation behind that carving was not the desire to leave a historical record for future researchers. It was the desperate need to preserve the name of the prince who had died, to say his name in stone in the only way available to them, to ensure through the permanence of carved rock that Nefertiti continued to exist in some form, even here, even at the end of the world, even in the darkness of an Australian night under stars that faced the wrong direction. That impulse, the impulse to carve the name of the beloved into something that will outlast the carver, is not an ancient Egyptian impulse. It is a human one. It is the impulse that makes people engrave the names of the dead on headstones, on monuments, on the walls of public buildings. It is the impulse behind the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, wall after wall of names pressed into black granite, each one a life, each one held in stone against the erasure of time. It is the impulse behind the memorial plaques on park benches, the names on the backs of donated chairs in concert halls, the letters scratched into the stone of lovers' bridges in Paris and Rome and Seoul. We carve names because we cannot bear to let go. We carve names because stone endures and flesh does not. We carve names because the alternative is silence, and silence is the thing we fear most. If those hieroglyphs on the walls of the Kariong Valley are genuine, they are 4,000 years of silence interrupted. They are the name of a prince held in stone through 40 centuries of rain and drought and bushfire, and the slow, patient turning of the world, waiting for someone to come along who could read them and say the name aloud, and so, in the Egyptian understanding, give the dead prince a moment of continued existence. Nefertiti, beautiful in the fashion of Ra, a young man who sailed further from home than any person from his civilization had ever sailed, who died in a country with no name in any language he knew, whose sailors pressed his name into the walls of a valley in New South Wales with whatever tools they had and whatever hope they carried for the efficacy of their writing in a land where their gods had no jurisdiction. Whatever else the Kariong site is, that story is worth sitting with. Now, let us take a wider view, because the Kariong hieroglyphs are one node in a much larger question that has been preoccupying researchers across multiple disciplines for several decades. The question of pre-Columbian contact, the possibility of contact between the Old World and the New World, and more broadly between the various geographically separate regions of the ancient world, before the European age of exploration, is no longer a fringe concern. It has been moving steadily toward the center of academic historical inquiry, driven by an accumulating weight of genetic, archaeological, and documentary evidence that the established framework cannot fully absorb without revision. The genetic evidence is the most striking. Genetic studies of Native American populations published in the 2010s established definitively that there was contact between Polynesian navigators and indigenous South Americans long before Columbus's 1492 voyage. The genetic signature of this contact is visible in the genomes of indigenous peoples in Chile and other parts of coastal South America. Sweet potatoes, which are native to the Americas, were being cultivated in Polynesia before European contact. a transfer that required human agency. The chicken, which is a Southeast Asian bird, was present in coastal South America before European contact, demonstrated by radiocarbon dating of pre-Columbian chicken bones. These are not theoretical possibilities. They are documented facts that required the revision of the previously accepted model. Similarly, genetic studies of peoples in the Amazon basin have detected a surprising genetic affinity with indigenous Australians and peoples from Southeast Asia that is not explained by the current model of the initial peopling of the Americas. This result, published in 2015 in the journal Nature and generated by a team from Harvard Medical School, caused significant excitement and controversy when it appeared and has not been fully explained by any subsequent study. The researchers themselves speculated that it might represent a very ancient wave of migration into the Americas from populations related to Aboriginal Australians, possibly predating the main founding population. Or it might represent ancient contact between South American and Australian populations mediated by Pacific navigation. Neither explanation is comfortable. Both are worth taking seriously. The implication for the Kariong story is not direct, but it is contextual. The genetic evidence from the Americas establishes that the ancient world was more connected than the standard model acknowledges. It establishes that people were making long-distance ocean voyages and establishing detectable genetic connections across oceanic distances well before the period when such voyages are supposed to have occurred. Against this backdrop, an Egyptian maritime expedition reaching Australia, while still remarkable, is not in a different category of implausibility than a Polynesian navigator reaching South America. Both require ancient maritime capability that has been underestimated. Both challenge the received historical framework. Both are supported by physical evidence that the received framework struggles to accommodate. The difference is that the Polynesian South American contact is now accepted by mainstream science because the genetic evidence is unambiguous and the mechanism of contact, traditional Polynesian navigation, is well documented. The potential Egyptian-Australian contact rests on more ambiguous evidence. The carvings at Kariong, which could in principle be explained as a hoax, plus the contextual evidence from the cocaine mummies and the broader pattern of anomalous finds in Australia, which is suggestive but not definitive. The investigation that would make the Kariong evidence unambiguous remains undone. This is the frustration at the heart of the story. Not the uncertainty itself, which is a natural condition of incomplete investigation, but the unnecessary prolongation of the uncertainty by the failure to conduct the available investigation. The tools exist to test these questions rigorously. The scientific expertise exists, the site exists. What has been missing is the institutional will to apply the tools to the site. Perhaps that will change. The increasing public interest in alternative archaeology, driven partly by popular media and the internet's democratization of access to historical anomalies, has created a constituency for this kind of investigation that did not exist 50 years ago. The field of ancient DNA analysis, which has revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric human migration in the last decade, is now capable of extracting and analyzing genetic material from very old and very degraded samples. If the Kariong tomb were opened and found to contain human remains, even ancient and degraded remains, modern paleogenomic analysis would almost certainly be able to determine whether those remains were of Egyptian or Egyptian-affiliated origin. That analysis would take a matter of weeks in a well-equipped laboratory. The tomb has been sealed for however long it has been sealed. Australia's central coast continues to grow and develop around the quiet anomaly of the Kariong Valley. New housing estates push further into the bush north of Sydney. Roads are built and widened. Telecommunications towers appear on the ridgelines. The ordinary business of 21st century life proceeds at its frantic pace within a few kilometers of a sandstone corridor where something happened. At some point in time, that pressed symbols from one of the greatest ancient civilizations into the rock face of this unlikely country. The contrast is striking when you stand in the valley and think about it. The highway noise filters through the eucalyptus trees. Occasionally a light aircraft passes overhead. And here, on these sandstone walls, are marks that might be 4,000 years old or might be 150 years old, pressed into the rock by hands that are gone and unreachable regardless of when they were there. The ordinary and the extraordinary sit together in Australia with a particular ease. The country has always been full of things that should not, by the standard reckoning, be there. Animals that give birth through pouches, rivers that run inland to salt lakes in the desert, trees that shed their bark instead of their leaves, rocks that are older than any other rocks on the surface of the earth. Australia has always required its visitors and its residents to revise their expectations. The continent is a standing demonstration that the familiar categories do not always apply. Perhaps that is why this particular mystery feels at home here. The Kariong Hieroglyphs, whatever they are, belong in Australia in some deep sense. They are strange in the right kind of way. They are the kind of impossible thing that Australia has always been capable of producing. They are patient and ambiguous and deeply connected to the ground they sit in, which is the sandstone that was old before the first human ancestors climbed down from the trees in Africa, which was old before the dinosaurs, which was old when the sea that would eventually become the Indian Ocean was just beginning to separate from the ancient supercontinent. In that context, 4,000 years is nothing. The question of whether ancient Egyptians were here or not is a recent question, a question that only became possible to ask when the Egyptian writing system was deciphered and the possibility of pre-European contact became conceivable. Before Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone in 1822, the symbols at Kariong would have been unrecognizable as anything specific. They would have been strange marks on a rock face made by unknown hands for unknown purposes. After 822, they became legible, at least in principle, and the fact that they became legible as Egyptian hieroglyphs rather than as any other writing system is the central fact that this story has to account for. You do not accidentally carve Egyptian hieroglyphs. The writing system is specific, rule-governed, and complex. If the symbols at Kariong are genuine hieroglyphs and not merely vaguely similar shapes that a pattern-hungry mind is interpreting as hieroglyphs, they had to have been made by someone who knew the system, either someone with genuine ancient knowledge of Egyptian writing, or someone in the modern era with access to Egyptological references, or something in between, some form of intermediary transmission of the writing system that reached Australia through channels we have not traced. Each of those possibilities is interesting. Each of them represents a history we do not currently know. Each of them is worth investigating. The symbols in the sandstone are waiting for that investigation. They have been waiting for a long time. They can wait a little longer, but perhaps not forever. The sandstone weathers, slowly in a sheltered position, but steadily nonetheless. Water and lichen and the freezing and thawing of winter nights and the expansion and contraction of summer heat all do their work on the rock, grain by grain, year by year. The valley at Kariong will not hold its secret forever. At some point, weathering will reach a threshold beyond which the symbols are no longer readable by any available method, regardless of how sophisticated our technology becomes. What is carved in stone is more durable than flesh, but less durable than geological time. The window of investigation is open. It will not be open indefinitely. That is the urgency underneath the mystery, the quiet ticking of geological time pressing against human indecision. Whether the Kariong Hieroglyphs represent an ancient Egyptian expedition to Australia, or a 19th century hoax, or something in between those possibilities, they deserve an answer. The people who lived in this valley, whoever they were and whenever they were there, deserve to be known rather than merely speculated about. The sealed tomb deserves to be examined rather than merely wondered about. The stone deserves to be dated rather than merely argued about. This is the call that the mystery makes, not for belief, not for certainty, but for the courage to look. There is a particular quality to waiting that changes depending on how long the wait has been. A person who has been waiting for 5 minutes experiences time differently from someone who has been waiting 5 years, and both experience time differently from stone, which does not experience waiting at all but simply endures. The sandstone of the Kariong Valley has endured through time periods that the human mind cannot really hold without effort. 250 million years since the sediment settled and compressed into rock. 45,000 years at the most conservative estimate of Aboriginal occupation of this specific landscape. Somewhere between 4,000 years and 150 years since the first marks were pressed into the wall. Against those numbers, the 50 years of modern investigation seem very short, and the institutional resistance to proper examination seems very small, and the indecision about whether to open the sealed tomb seems, when you consider it in geological time, almost comically brief. The Earth is patient in ways that we are not. The Australian continent has been drifting north from the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana for roughly 50 million years and is currently moving at approximately 7 centimeters per year, which means that in your lifetime the continent will travel roughly 5 meters, and in the next 1,000 years it will travel 7 kilometers, and in 1,000,000 years it will be in a significantly different position relative to the equator, and the climate of the central coast will be different, and the ecology of the valley at Kariong will be different, and whoever is here then, if anyone is, will encounter a landscape that the people who carved those walls would not recognize. Against that backdrop, the window of human history is very short. The window of literate, technologically sophisticated human history capable of investigating this mystery is shorter still. We have been able to read Egyptian hieroglyphs for 200 years. We have had the scientific tools required to properly date and analyze sites like Kariong for perhaps the last 50. We have had the genetic analysis capability to potentially test DNA from ancient remains at the site for perhaps the last 20. Each of those windows opened and has been partly used for other purposes, while the valley at Kariong waited. The responsibility for what we know and do not know about this site belongs to all of us. Collectively, as a civilization that has chosen to allocate its investigative resources in particular ways and not in others. We fund particle accelerators and space telescopes and sequencing projects of enormous scale. We have chosen, as a civilization, not to fund a comprehensive geological and archaeological investigation of a sandstone valley in New South Wales that might or might not contain evidence of contact between ancient Egypt and Australia. That choice is reversible. It has not been made forever. Any government with a research budget, any university with an archaeology or geology department, any philanthropist with an interest in the deep history of humanity could change this situation within a year. The tools exist, the site exists, the question is alive. Someone reading this or watching it at some point in the time after it was made might be the person who changes this, might be the graduate student who proposes the dating study, might be the documentary filmmaker whose work reaches the right audience, might be the politician whose constituency includes the Kariong Valley and who decides for whatever reason that this is a question worth funding, might be the Aboriginal community member whose family has a story about the valley that has not yet been shared with outside researchers. These things happen. The accumulation of small, determined efforts by people who cared enough to keep asking the question has kept the Kariong mystery alive for 50 years. It could keep it alive for another 50, and at some point, the combination of curiosity and technology and willingness to look might produce an answer. That is the best case scenario. And it is not an unrealistic one. Let us do something unusual now and sit quietly with the mystery for a moment rather than continuing to interrogate it. Outside your window, wherever you are, the world is doing what it does at this hour. The stars are moving through their slow wheel above whatever cloud cover hides them. The city or the countryside or the suburban street is settling into its overnight state. The animals that are active at this hour are active, and the ones that rest at night are resting, and the whole enormous interconnected system of life on this planet is proceeding at its usual pace, indifferent to our questions and our theories and our need to know. And in New South Wales, on the Central Coast, in a sandstone valley surrounded by eucalyptus trees and the sounds of the Australian night, the hieroglyphs are sitting in the dark. The Southern Cross is visible through the gap in the canopy above the valley, the same Southern Cross that has been visible from this spot for longer than human beings have been in Australia. The possums are moving through the trees, the boobook owl is calling, the sandstone walls carry their symbols out of sight in the dark, patient as they have always been patient. Whatever is sealed in the tomb at the base of the carved wall is sealed in the same darkness it has occupied since the stone was placed over its entrance. It is a strangely peaceful thing to contemplate. The not knowing, the sealed darkness, the symbols waiting in the stone. Human beings are not well designed for mystery. Our minds are built to resolve uncertainty, to move from question to answer as quickly as possible, to find the pattern and the conclusion and the safe ground of known territory. This is the cognitive machinery that has allowed us to survive and thrive in a world full of ambiguity and danger. The ability to process incomplete information rapidly and reach a conclusion that is good enough, even if not perfect, is enormously valuable when you're a hunter-gatherer, and the rustling in the long grass needs to be classified as threat or non-threat in a fraction of a second. But it works against us when we encounter mysteries that genuinely cannot be resolved with the available information. The mind keeps pushing for a conclusion. It prefers the wrong answer to no answer. This is why hoaxes succeed, why conspiracy theories proliferate, why pseudoscience flourishes. The mind's need for closure drives it to choose a bad explanation over sustained uncertainty. The Kariong Hieroglyphs have attracted both flavors of premature closure. The skeptic who says hoax and moves on, satisfied, is seeking the same relief from uncertainty as the enthusiast who says ancient Egyptians and constructs an elaborate framework of corroborating evidence around the conclusion. Both are closing a question that should remain open. Both are trading intellectual honesty for the comfort of certainty. The harder thing and the more honest thing is to sit with the uncertainty, to say, yes, the symbols are there. Yes, they look genuinely Egyptian. Yes, the hoax hypothesis has problems. Yes, the authentic ancient origin hypothesis also has problems. Yes, the investigation that would resolve the question has not been done. And to leave the question open, uncomfortable, alive, generating thought and investigation and curiosity, which is what open questions are supposed to do. That is the intellectual tradition of genuine inquiry, the tradition that has produced the greatest advances in human understanding. Not the forcing of questions into pre-approved answers, but the sustained willingness to sit with not knowing and keep working. The people who built the pyramids, if they sailed to Australia, knew how to sit with not knowing. They were navigating across waters with no chart, following stars. They were learning as they went, making decisions with incomplete information in real time, surviving on their wits and their courage and the accumulated navigational knowledge of their culture. They would have understood the discomfort of not knowing where they were or when they would see home again. They would have known it viscerally in the body, in the sleepless nights on the water, in the calculation of provisions and the reading of weather, and the fear that comes when the wind changes in a way that the navigational tradition has not prepared you for. That courage, the courage to go into the unknown, is also inscribed in the stone at Kariong, if the hieroglyphs are genuine. The same hands that carved the grief of loss also carried the courage of exploration. They went where no one in their world had gone before, or if others had gone, no record has survived of it. They went to find whatever lay at the end of the world, and they found something they could not have imagined. A continent of red rock and strange animals and people who had been there for 40,000 years, and who looked at them with the same bewilderment that they felt. That encounter between those hypothetical Egyptian sailors and the Aboriginal people of the Central Coast is the detail of the Kariong story that I find most compelling and most moving. Not the hieroglyphs themselves, not the tomb, not the academic argument, but the moment of first contact. Two groups of human beings meeting across a gulf of cultural difference so vast that they shared almost nothing, not language, not religion, not the animals they knew, not the stars they navigated by, not the food they ate, not the gods they prayed to. And yet, the same sky above both of them, the same sun rising in the morning, the same need for water and food and shelter and the presence of others, the same capacity for grief and wonder and the impulse to mark what matters in whatever medium is available, the same fundamental humanity. Whether that meeting happened or not, whether the Kariong hieroglyphs are the record of it or not, the possibility of it is beautiful. The possibility that two groups of people whose worlds had never overlapped found themselves in the same sandstone valley in the New South Wales bush and looked at each other across an unbridgeable distance and recognized in whatever imperfect way was available to them that they were looking at other human beings. That is a story worth telling, regardless of whether we can prove it happened. And now the night is deeper, wherever you are. The questions are still open. The stone is still patient. The tomb is still sealed. The Southern Cross is still turning above the valley. Let the mystery settle around you like a blanket. Let the not knowing be comfortable for a moment rather than urgent. Let the questions slow down to the pace of geological time. which is the pace of the sandstone, which is the pace of the continent drifting north at 7 centimeters per year. You do not need to resolve the Kariong mystery tonight. Nobody does. It has been unresolved for however long it has been there, and it will remain unresolved until someone with the right tools and the right will and the right permissions comes along and does the work. That may be soon. That may be not for a very long time. The stone will wait either way, and you can rest. The mystery is real. The questions are real. The symbols in the sandstone are real in the sense that they are there, whatever they are, pressed into the rock by hands that held their tools with intention. The rest can wait until morning. Let us go somewhere else for a while, somewhere quite different before returning to the valley. Let us go to the Red Sea coast of Egypt, roughly 4,500 years ago, to the harbor at Wadi al-Jarf, which is currently one of the most important archaeological sites in the world for understanding ancient Egyptian maritime capability. The harbor was excavated beginning in 2011 by a team of French and Egyptian archaeologists, and what they found there has quietly transformed the scholarly understanding of what the Egyptians were doing on the water during the Old Kingdom period. The harbor at Wadi al-Jarf is old, very old. It dates to the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh responsible for the Great Pyramid at Giza, which means it was operational roughly 4,500 years ago, placing it squarely in the Old Kingdom period that the Kariong translation associates with the voyage to Australia. The harbour consists of a long L-shaped jetty built from carefully dressed stone blocks, storage galleries cut into the cliffs above the shore, and, most remarkably, a collection of papyrus logs and fragments that represent the oldest maritime logbooks ever found. The logbooks were written by a man named Merer, who held the title of inspector and who was responsible for organizing the transport of limestone from the quarries at Tura, on the east bank of the Nile near Cairo, to the construction site at Giza, where the Great Pyramid was being built. Mera's logs describe in extraordinary detail the daily activities of his team, the loading and departure of ships, the timing of journeys up and down the Nile, the quantities of goods transported. They also describe trips to the Sinai Peninsula to obtain copper, which was the primary metal used in Egyptian tools and weapons of this period. The logs establish definitively that during the reign of Khufu, Egyptian maritime operations on the Red Sea were sophisticated, well organized, and capable of multi-day open water voyages. The harbor at Wadi al-Jarf was a permanent installation, not a temporary camp, fitted with storage facilities that could support extended operations. The ships using it were significant vessels, capable of carrying substantial cargo across the open water of the northern Red Sea. This is not speculation. This is documented historical fact from primary sources dating to the period of interest. The Egyptians of the Old Kingdom were active maritime operators in the Red Sea during exactly the period that the Kariong translation associates with its supposed voyage. The distance from the Red Sea to Australia is enormous. Let us be clear about that. From the mouth of the Gulf of Suez to the northwest coast of Australia is roughly 10,000 kilometers in a straight line, and the actual sailing distance following the available wind and current systems would be considerably longer. This is not a journey that would have been undertaken lightly or that would necessarily have been intended from the outset. The most plausible scenario, if the voyage happened at all, is that an expedition that set out with more modest intentions, perhaps to push further south along the East African coast than previous voyages, or to follow up on rumors of land beyond the limits of the known Red Sea trade routes, was carried by favorable winds and the logic of maritime exploration into waters that went further than anyone had intended. This is how most great maritime discoveries have happened historically. Not as planned expeditions to known destinations, but as the result of following available winds and currents, of being curious about what lay beyond the current horizon, of making a decision at each successive stage of a voyage to continue rather than to turn back. Vasco da Gama's rounding of the Cape of Good Hope was preceded by decades of incremental southward probing along the African coast, each expedition going a little further than the last until the full route revealed itself. The settlement of the Pacific was not a single planned expedition from a known starting point to a known destination, but a series of island hops, each one extending knowledge a little further into the unknown. An Egyptian expedition that set out to push the limits of Red Sea knowledge, that found itself carried by the seasonal monsoon winds further south and east than intended, that discovered the coast of Somalia or Tanzania and then continued further, following the winds and the logic of curiosity, could in principle have eventually found itself approaching the northwestern coast of Australia, which at certain times of year is downwind from the Indonesian archipelago in exactly the way that the prevailing maritime routes of the Indian Ocean world predict. Whether this happened is not something we can determine from current evidence. It is something we can determine from a properly investigated site at Kariong. Let us also take a moment to think about what the voyage home would have looked like if any sailors survived to attempt it. The seasonal monsoon reversal that makes the Indian Ocean navigable in both directions would have worked in their favor, but only if they were in the right position at the right time of year to catch the returning winds. If a group of Egyptian sailors arrived on the Australian coast in the northern autumn, following the northeast monsoon south, they would need to wait roughly 6 months before the southwest monsoon would carry them back. 6 months in an unknown country, waiting for the right wind, grieving for a prince who had died, perhaps in contact with Aboriginal people whose hospitality was either offered or withheld. What would they have done during that 6 months? Explored, repaired their vessel, sought provisions, attempted communication with the people they found, wondered whether any of them would live to see Egypt again, possibly carved things into the sandstone walls of a sheltered valley where they had made their camp, and perhaps some of them did not survive to make the return voyage. Perhaps only a few sailed back, carrying fragments of a story that was too strange and too painful to fully tell, that found its way into administrative records now lost, or into oral traditions now unrecoverable, or that was simply buried with the sailors when they eventually died in Egypt, too old and too far from the experience to communicate it effectively to anyone who might have recorded it. The silence of ancient sources is not a neutral fact. It is shaped by what was considered worth recording, what was considered credible, what was considered honorable, and what was so far outside the known world that no framework for understanding it existed. An Egyptian official who returned from a voyage to an unknown continent at the end of the world, who reported that the prince entrusted to his care had died there and been buried in foreign soil without proper rites, who described animals and people and plants that matched nothing in any Egyptian reference, would not necessarily have been believed or celebrated. He might have been doubted. He might have been dismissed. He might have learned very quickly to stop telling the story. History is full of truths that were suppressed not by active conspiracy, but by the passive weight of disbelief. The person who tells a story that falls outside the available framework of understanding is not usually silenced by force. They are simply not believed, which is a more effective silencer because it operates without opposition. The hypothesis that Egyptian sailors reached Australia and that their story was not preserved because it was not believed is speculative. Everything in this story beyond the physical existence of the carvings is speculative to a greater or lesser degree, but it is speculative in a way that is consistent with what we know about how knowledge is preserved and lost in pre-literate and early literate cultures. What would make the Kariong story compelling as more than speculation is the kind of evidence that a proper investigation of the site could provide. A tomb that contained identifiable remains, bones that yielded to genetic analysis and showed a North African or Near Eastern signature inconsistent with any known pre-European Australian population, grave goods that were identifiably Egyptian in origin, or alternatively, a geological dating of the carvings that placed them firmly in the modern era and ended the discussion cleanly in the other direction. Either answer would be valuable. The absence of investigation produces neither answer, which is the worst possible outcome for everyone who cares about the truth. There is something to be said about what happens to a person who spends too long looking at unsolvable mysteries. There is a kind of cognitive fatigue that sets in, a point at which the sustained uncertainty becomes more draining than energizing, at which the open question feels less like an invitation and more like a burden. This is the occupational hazard of anyone who devotes serious time to anomalies like the Kariong Hieroglyphs. The mystery does not resolve, the investigation does not happen, the years pass and the sandstone weathers, and the argument continues in the same grooves it has always followed. And it starts to feel as though the question might never be answered, not because the answer does not exist, but because the people with the power to find it are not looking. The researchers who have devoted the most years to the Kariong site know this fatigue well. Some of them have stepped back, disillusioned by the institutional resistance to proper investigation. Some of them have doubled down, finding new angles and new evidence to pursue. Some of them have simply continued year after year, going back to the valley, taking new photographs in new light conditions, corresponding with scholars in other countries, waiting for the moment when the combination of circumstances produces the investigation they have spent decades calling for. The patience required for that is remarkable. It is the patience of people who have decided that the question matters more than their comfort, who have decided that sitting with an open wound of not knowing is preferable to the false comfort of a premature conclusion. It is the patience in a different register of the stone itself, and it is the patience that good questions require. The questions that have driven the greatest advances in human understanding. The question of whether the earth moved or the sun moved. The question of whether disease was caused by bad air or by small organisms. The question of whether species were fixed or capable of change. All of them required sustained patience from the people who held them open against the pressure of institutional certainty. All of them were eventually answered in favor of the heterodox position. All of them required a willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing for longer than comfortable. The carry-on question may be in that category, or it may not. We genuinely do not know. But the posture required to find out, the willingness to look seriously, to investigate rigorously, to follow the evidence wherever it leads without prior commitment to a conclusion, is the same posture that has produced every genuine advance in human understanding. It is the only posture that serves truth, and truth, wherever it is worth finding. Even when it is carved into a sandstone wall in a eucalyptus valley on the central coast of New South Wales, in a writing system from the banks of the Nile, waiting for someone to come along who can read it and say the name it carries aloud and restore, for a moment, the existence of whoever put it there. Even then, especially then. And so we come to the last part of this long night's wandering, this slow walk through one of the strangest and most persistently unresolved mysteries in the ancient history of Australia. We have covered a great deal of ground. We have walked through the sandstone valley at Kariong and looked at the symbols cut into its walls. We have traced the history of Egyptian maritime capability and found it to be considerably more extensive than the popular image of Egypt as a landlocked desert civilization allows. We have examined the arguments of the skeptics and found them to be partly convincing and partly incomplete. We have examined the arguments of those who believe the site is genuine and found them similarly mixed. We have followed threads from the Kariong Valley out into the wider world, to the cocaine mummies and the genetic evidence of pre-Columbian oceanic contact and the documented maritime achievements of ancient Polynesia, and found a pattern suggesting that the Bronze Age world was considerably more connected across its oceanic distances than mainstream history has traditionally acknowledged. We have sat with the image of Egyptian sailors, far from home, grieving, carving a prince's name into unfamiliar stone. We have thought about what it means to be remembered. We have considered the patience of stone and the impatience of human institutions and the frustration of a question that could be answered if only someone chose to answer it. And we have arrived here at the end of the story, which is also not the end at all, but simply the current edge of the known, the place where the carved text runs out and the blank stone begins. There is something I want to say before we close, something that does not fit neatly into the evidentiary framework we have been using, but that feels important nonetheless. Whatever the Kariong Hieroglyphs ultimately prove to be, they exist in a landscape that is itself one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. The Aboriginal people of the central coast of New South Wales have been here for at least 40,000 years, and possibly longer. Their relationship with this land is one of the most profound and sustained human relationships with a place that our species has ever achieved. They know the sandstone country of the Central Coast in ways that no outside researcher can fully comprehend, because that knowledge is not just factual, not just a collection of information about plants and animals and water sources and weather patterns, but ontological, a mode of being in the world that grows from generations of unbroken presence in a specific place. The mystery of the Kariong Hieroglyphs belongs, in a sense, to that landscape and to the people whose relationship with the landscape goes deepest. Whatever happened in the valley at Kariong, whether it happened 4,000 years ago or 150 years ago, it happened on land that Aboriginal people have known and cared for and maintained a living relationship with across the entire span of human civilization. The idea that this mystery can be resolved without the full participation of Aboriginal communities is not just politically problematic, but epistemologically wrong. The people who know this landscape best have information that outside researchers cannot access through any other means. The investigation that the Kariong site deserves is not just a geological and genetic investigation, though it is certainly those things. It is also a sustained, respectful, patient engagement with the oral traditions and the ecological knowledge and the living memory of the communities who have been here the longest. That kind of engagement cannot be rushed, it cannot be extracted. It has to be built through relationship over time, through trust earned slowly and carefully, through the recognition that Aboriginal knowledge of this landscape is not a supplement to the scientific investigation, but an equal and possibly superior source of understanding about what this place is and what it has held. The researchers who have come closest to genuine progress on the Kariong mystery are the ones who have understood this, who have approached Aboriginal communities not as sources of data to be extracted, but as partners in a shared inquiry, who have shared what they know and listened to what is offered in return with genuine openness to having their assumptions revised. That is the model the investigation needs. It is also, not coincidentally, the model that good science needs in any domain where local and traditional knowledge has something to offer. The integration of scientific method with traditional ecological and historical knowledge is one of the most productive frontiers in contemporary research across many fields, from climate science to conservation biology to archaeology. The Kariong investigation, properly conducted, could be an example of how that integration works in practice. That is, if someone chooses to conduct it. The stars above the Kariong Valley tonight are the same stars that have been above it every night for the entire history of our species and considerably beyond. They have moved very slowly in their long precession, the wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts the apparent position of stars against the background of the sky over cycles of roughly 26,000 years. The stars that an Egyptian sailor would have seen looking up from the valley 4,000 years ago were not quite the same stars visible tonight. The same stars, but in slightly different positions relative to each other and to the horizon. 4,000 years is not enough time for the precession to move them dramatically, but it is enough for a skilled astronomer to detect the difference. This means that if someone could definitively date the Kariong carvings using astronomical information encoded in the symbols, that dating could potentially be cross-referenced against the precession cycle to produce an independent age estimate. The possibility that astronomical information is encoded in the site has been raised by some researchers and dismissed as speculative by others. The dismissal is premature. The examination has not been thorough enough to rule it out. Everything about the Kariong investigation keeps coming back to that word, premature. The dismissal was premature. The conclusions on both sides have been premature. The declaration of hoax was premature. The edifice of alternative history constructed on the foundation of the site's authenticity is premature. What has not been premature is the question itself, which has been asked at exactly the right time, given that the site exists and the tools to investigate it exist, and the academic tradition that could do the work exists, all at the same moment in history. The question arrived on time. The investigation is overdue, and yet, even as we note its overdueness, there is something to be said for the mystery itself, for the unresolved state of the question. The Kariong Hieroglyphs, in their current state of not knowing, function as a kind of standing invitation to curiosity. They invite people who might not otherwise have thought seriously about ancient maritime capability, or the history of pre-European Australia, or the politics of academic knowledge, to engage with all of those things. They are a door that opens into a much larger room, and the room contains questions that matter, regardless of how the Kariong question is ultimately resolved. questions about who ancient people were and what they could do, questions about the completeness of our historical knowledge and the gaps that remain in it, questions about how knowledge gets preserved and how it gets lost, questions about what it means to be remembered and what it means to be forgotten, questions about the relationship between curiosity and certainty, between investigation and assumption, between the open question and the closed one. These are not small questions. They are the questions that define how we relate to our own past and, through that relationship, to our own present and future. A civilization that knows its history well is better equipped to navigate its present than one that operates on simplified and incomplete accounts of where it came from and what it has done. The Kariong Hieroglyphs, whatever they prove to be, are an argument for taking the history of human presence on this planet more seriously, for resisting the comfortable simplifications that make the past feel more manageable but less true. That argument does not require the hieroglyphs to be genuine ancient Egyptian inscriptions. It is made by their existence and by the resistance to properly investigating them, regardless of their authenticity. The argument is, look, actually look, with the tools available, with the willingness to be surprised, with the patience to let the evidence say what it says rather than what you want it to say, with the respect for the landscape and the people who have always inhabited it that good investigation requires. Look, that is the invitation the carved walls extend in whatever language they are written. It is an invitation that deserves to be accepted. And now, at last, the story slows. Not because the mystery is resolved, not because the questions have been answered, but because the night is deep enough, wherever you are, that the mind is ready to rest. The questions will still be there in the morning. The symbols will still be in the sandstone. The sealed tomb will still be sealed. The world is patient, the stone is patient, and you can be patient too, letting the mystery settle around you like a blanket, letting the not knowing become comfortable the way darkness becomes comfortable after you have been in it long enough for your eyes to adjust. Somewhere on the central coast of New South Wales, the eucalyptus trees are dropping their bark. The possums are moving through the canopy. The Southern Cross is doing what it has done every night for as long as there have been nights, turning slowly above the valley where the symbols wait in the sandstone, holding whatever truth they hold, patient as the continent beneath them, patient as the ancient ocean that surrounds this ancient land. Let their patience be contagious. Let the not knowing be comfortable. Let the mystery be what it is, which is a real thing in the real world, worth taking seriously, worth investigating when the time and the will and the permission align. And in the meantime, in this moment, let it simply be what it is in the darkness. A question pressed into stone by hands unknown for reasons we have not yet fully understood. The most human thing imaginable. The most human thing there is. Sleep well wherever you are on this spinning world. When you wake, the mystery will be waiting for you. Patient as sandstone, patient as the stars, patient as a name carved into a wall at the end of the world that is still waiting after all this time for someone to say it aloud and bring it back for a moment into the light. Nefertiru. Beautiful in the fashion of Ra, remembered at last. If this long journey through the mystery of the Kariong Hieroglyphs helped you drift towards sleep, or simply kept you company through the hours, that is all these stories are made for. You can tap like if you felt something here. Not because the algorithm needs feeding, though it does, but because it tells me that this kind of careful, unhurried exploration of history and mystery and the strange edges of what we know is what you want more of. Subscribe if you would like to return to these quiet places regularly, where the questions matter more than the conclusions and the journey lasts longer than the destination. And leave a comment if you feel moved to, telling me where in the world you are listening from, what time it is there, what the quality of darkness is outside your window. I read everyone. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that this strange story about symbols in a sandstone valley in New South Wales was heard in so many different places on this planet, by so many different people in so many different hours of the night. We are scattered and we keep meeting in these spaces. It is one of the genuinely good things about this strange world we have built. Thank you for being here. Sleep well. Let us go back out to sea for a while because the ocean itself has a role in this story that has not yet been fully explored. The Indian Ocean is the smallest of the world's three major oceans and also the most enclosed, bounded to the north by the land masses of Asia and Africa, to the west by the eastern coast of Africa, to the east by the long chain of Indonesia and the western edge of Australia, and to the south by the open waters of the Southern Ocean. This enclosed quality gives the Indian Ocean a particular character that distinguishes it from both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Its winds are seasonal and predictable in a way that those larger oceans' winds are not. The monsoon system that drives the Indian Ocean's weather is the product of the differential heating of the large land masses to the north, the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent, and the vast body of Central Asia, which heats and cools far more dramatically than the ocean itself. In summer, these land masses heat rapidly, creating a low-pressure system that pulls moist ocean air north, generating the southwest monsoon that brings rain to India and East Africa and the Arabian coast. In winter, the land masses cool and the pressure reverses, pushing dry air south and east across the ocean, generating the northeast monsoon that blows from the Arabian Gulf down toward the coast of East Africa. And if you follow it far enough south and east toward the waters northwest of Australia, ancient mariners understood this system long before anyone wrote it down. They understood it in the way that all traditional navigational knowledge is held, not as a theory to be applied, but as a fact of the world, as natural and self-evident as the fact that water flows downhill. The fishermen of the Arabian coast knew that the northeast monsoon was the season for sailing south. The fishermen of East Africa knew that the southwest monsoon was the season for sailing north. The exchange of this knowledge across the maritime communities of the Western Indian Ocean created an informal but highly effective navigational system that sustained trade routes of enormous length for thousands of years before anyone formally mapped them. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek text dating from roughly the 1st century of the Common Era, describes the Indian Ocean trade routes in considerable detail, including the use of the monsoon system by mariners traveling from the Red Sea to India and back. But the Periplus was not describing a newly discovered system. It was describing a system that had been in use for centuries, possibly millennia, before its Greek author wrote it down. The monsoon routes of the Indian Ocean are ancient, and the knowledge required to use them is ancient, and the maritime cultures that possessed and transmitted that knowledge are older than any written record of their activities. Egyptian sailors operating on the Red Sea would have had direct experience of the northern portion of this system. The Red Sea, which lies between the northeast monsoon zone and the Nile Valley, has its own wind patterns, complex and seasonal, that experienced Red Sea mariners would have mastered over generations. Contact with the maritime cultures of the Arabian coast, with whom Egypt traded extensively, would have given Egyptian navigators access to knowledge of the monsoon system that extended well beyond the limits of their direct experience. The question of how far this knowledge extended, whether Egyptian sailors of the Old Kingdom period had access to information about the winds and currents that could carry a vessel from the Red Sea to the coast of Australia, is not one we can answer definitively. But it is also not one we should assume to answer in the negative simply because it is convenient. The knowledge existed in the Indian Ocean maritime world, the degree to which it was accessible to Egyptian sailors, who had economic and political connections to that maritime world through their trade relationships with the Arabian coast, is genuinely uncertain. What we can say is that the mechanism required for an Egyptian vessel to reach Australia, the monsoon wind system, was real, was ancient, and was understood by maritime cultures that were in contact with Egypt. The possibility that some of that knowledge was transmitted to Egyptian navigators, and that those navigators were curious or ambitious enough to act on it, is real. It is also worth noting that the period most commonly associated with the Kariong voyage, the Old Kingdom period of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, was a period of significant Egyptian expansion and exploration across multiple fronts. The Egyptians were pushing into Nubia to the south, establishing trade relationships and military presences along the Upper Nile. They were trading extensively with the Levant to the northeast, importing cedar from Lebanon and copper from Sinai. They were sending expeditions to Punt in the south through the Red Sea. The Old Kingdom was a period of outward-looking confidence, a civilization at a high point of its organizational and technical capability, curious about and engaged with the world beyond its borders. In that context, an exploratory maritime expedition that pushed further than any previous voyage is not a historical anomaly. It is a historical plausibility. Whether that particular expedition reached Australia and whether the Kariong Hieroglyphs are its record remains the open question, but the general character of the civilization at the relevant period supports the possibility. Let us also spend some time with the specific symbols at the site, because we have talked about them in general terms, but have not yet walked through the specific elements that Egyptologists and independent researchers have found most significant. Among the symbols identified at Kariong are several that have attracted particular attention because of their specificity. Specificity is important in this context, because a vague similarity to Egyptian writing could be produced by accident or by someone with only casual familiarity with the system. But specific and accurate renderings of particular signs or groups of signs require either genuinely ancient knowledge or a sophisticated modern effort at replication. The first category of symbols that researchers have found significant are the cartouches. In Egyptian writing, the cartouche is a distinctive oval outline that surrounds the names of pharaohs and royal family members. The oval represents a loop of rope tied at one end, symbolizing the circuit of the sun and, by extension, the protection of the divine name it enclosed. Cartouches are not a vague or generic feature of Egyptian writing. They are a specific convention with a specific form and a specific purpose. Finding a cartouche-like structure in the Kariong carvings is significantly more striking than finding a hieroglyph-like symbol, because cartouches are not something you would produce by accident or by casual copying of a few Egyptian symbols from a reference book. Ray Johnson identified what he believed to be two cartouches at the site, one containing the name elements he associated with Khufu or a member of the Khufu dynasty, and one containing the name he read as Nefertiru. Both identifications have been contested by professional Egyptologists, some of whom argue that the symbols within the oval outlines do not accurately represent any known royal name, and some of whom argue that the oval outlines themselves are too irregular to be genuine cartouches. Johnson's defenders point out that cartouches on Old Kingdom monuments show considerably more variation than the more standardized forms of later periods, and that the specific variations visible at Kariong are consistent with Old Kingdom conventions. This is a genuinely technical argument that requires expertise in Old Kingdom Egyptology to fully evaluate, and the number of people with that specific expertise who have carefully examined the full photographic record of the Kariong site is very small. Most of the dismissals and affirmations of the cartouche identification have been made on the basis of partial information, either photographs taken in suboptimal lighting conditions or tracings of the symbols made by researchers of varying skill. A proper high-resolution, multi-angle photographic survey of the site using current digital photography technology, combined with three-dimensional laser scanning that could capture the precise depth and profile of each carved groove, would provide the data needed for a definitive Egyptological assessment. That survey has not been done. The second category of symbols that researchers have found significant are the seated figures. Egyptian hieroglyphics include a number of determinative signs that clarify the meaning of the word they accompany without being read phonetically, that take the form of seated human figures in specific postures. The postures are conventionalized and specific. A seated male figure with hands on knees is a determinative used with words relating to men and their activities. A seated figure with a hand to its mouth is a determinative used with words relating to eating and speaking and similar activities. A seated figure with one arm raised is associated with praise and exaltation. These distinctions are not arbitrary. They are systematic and consistent across thousands of years of Egyptian writing. Among the symbols at Kariong, researchers have identified figures in specific seated postures that they argue correspond to these Egyptian determinative conventions. The degree of correspondence is disputed, as everything at this site is disputed. But the specific claim is that the postures of the seated figures are not random or generic, but correspond to the particular conventions of the Egyptian system in ways that would require either direct knowledge of that system or an extraordinarily lucky combination of random marks. The third category of significant symbols is the directional orientation of the text. Egyptian hieroglyphic text can be written in multiple directions, left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, and the direction of reading is indicated by the orientation of the figures in the text, which always face toward the beginning of the line. At Kariong, the text on the two parallel walls appears to be oriented consistently and in a way that is consistent with Egyptian convention, with the figures on each wall facing in a specific direction that indicates the direction of reading. This kind of systematic orientation is not something you would expect from random symbols or from casual copying without understanding. It suggests either a writer who knew the conventions of Egyptian writing or a very careful modern forger who attended to this specific detail. There are also several symbols at the site that have been identified as matching specific hieroglyphic signs with a degree of precision that researchers find significant. The owl hieroglyph, which in Egyptian writing represents the consonant M and is also used in certain grammatical constructions, has been identified at the site in a rendering that matches the Egyptian convention, including the posture of the bird and the positioning of its features in ways that are specific to the Egyptian system rather than generic to bird depictions in general. The seated woman with uraeus sign, which in Egyptian writing is associated with goddesses and royal women, has been identified in a rendering that includes the distinctive uraeus, the rearing cobra, that is a specific element of Egyptian royal and divine iconography. Each of these individual identifications can be contested. Each of them can be argued to be wishful interpretation of ambiguous marks. But the accumulation of specific correspondences across a large number of symbols, all pointing in the same direction, is harder to dismiss as coincidence than any single correspondence would be. The probability that multiple specific Egyptian conventions would be replicated by accident in a single site, all consistently applied and all corresponding to the same general period of Egyptian writing, decreases with each additional correspondence. This is not proof. It is, however, the kind of accumulating weight of evidence that demands investigation rather than dismissal, and the investigation, as we have established, has not been done. What has been done in the decades since the site was first formally documented is argument. Sustained, detailed, often passionate argument between people who have reached different conclusions on the basis of the same insufficient evidence. The argument has been productive in one sense, in that it has kept the question alive and has generated a body of documentary material about the site that future investigators can draw on. But it has been unproductive in the sense that it has not moved the needle on the fundamental question, which can only be moved by investigation rather than argument. The argument will continue. It always does, with anomalies of this kind. The people who believe the site is genuine will continue to accumulate evidence and make their case. The people who believe it is a hoax will continue to critique that evidence and offer their counter-arguments. The publication cycles of alternative history and academic archaeology will continue to process the debate at their respective paces, and the valley will continue to hold its symbols in the sandstone, patient as always, waiting for someone to arrive with the tools and the will and the permission to actually look. In the meantime, the story of the Kariong Hieroglyphs continues to do what good stories do. It spreads, it finds new audiences, it provokes new curiosity in new people who then bring their own perspectives and their own expertise to bear on the question. A geologist who hears the story for the first time thinks about what she knows about sandstone weathering and realizes that the dating question is more complex than the dismissals suggest. An Egyptologist who encounters the photographic record for the first time finds herself more uncertain than she expected to be about some of the symbols. A geneticist who reads about the sealed tomb thinks about what analysis of ancient remains from that location could tell us. The story does its work, slowly, with no guarantee of outcome, but persistently. And persistence is how the great anomalies of history eventually get resolved. Not by a single dramatic breakthrough, but by the slow accumulation of curiosity until the question reaches the critical mass that generates the investigation. We may be approaching that critical mass for the Kariong Hieroglyphs, or we may not be. The honest answer is that we do not know, and the future is as uncertain as the past is in this story. What we know is that the symbols are there. What we know is that the questions they raise are real. What we know is that the investigation that could resolve those questions is available but has not been done. Everything else is either established fact or open question, and keeping those two categories clearly distinct from each other is the fundamental intellectual discipline that this mystery, like all mysteries, requires. The stars are turning, the valley is quiet, the symbols are waiting, so are we. There is a particular quality to the Australian night that people who have not experienced it sometimes find difficult to believe when it is described. In the bush north of Sydney, away from the light pollution of the city, the darkness at 2 or 3 in the morning is not the soft ambient glow that most people in urban environments experience as darkness. It is genuine, total, and very old. The stars overhead are not the washed out suggestions that city dwellers see, but the full density of the Milky Way, which appears on clear nights as a river of light across the sky, structured and complex, with darker lanes of interstellar dust running through its brightness in ways that you could navigate by if you knew how. The Aboriginal people of Australia have been navigating by the Milky Way for at least 40,000 years. Their astronomical knowledge is among the most sophisticated of any indigenous culture on Earth, and it is encoded not just in practical navigation, but in a rich cosmological framework of stories and relationships and responsibilities that ties the movements of the sky to the movements and behaviors of the earth below. The dark constellations of Aboriginal astronomy, the shapes defined not by arrangements of stars, but by the dark lanes of interstellar dust in the Milky Way, are as detailed and as systematically organized as the star-based constellations of European astronomy, and they encode detailed ecological knowledge about the Australian landscape. The emu in the sky, for instance, appears in a specific orientation at the same time of year that emus on the ground are laying eggs, providing a natural calendar that integrates astronomical observation with ecological activity. This level of knowledge, this sustained and detailed and systematically organized attention to the sky, is what 40,000 years of continuous occupation looks like. It is what genuine deep knowledge of a place looks like. It is what happens when a people and a landscape develop a relationship over tens of thousands of generations that goes beyond the utilitarian and becomes something more like mutual understanding. Against that background of 40,000 years of Aboriginal astronomical knowledge, the question of whether Egyptian sailors arrived on the central coast of New South Wales 4,000 years ago is, in one sense, a very small question. It is a question about a brief episode in a history of enormous depth. Even if the answer is yes, even if the Kariong Hieroglyphs are exactly what they appear to be, the presence of a small group of Egyptian sailors for what was probably a period of months does not significantly alter the deep history of Aboriginal presence on this land. It does not diminish that presence. It does not complicate it in ways that are damaging. It adds a footnote to a story that is already one of the longest and most remarkable stories of human presence in any single place on Earth. But it is an important footnote, not because Egyptian contact is more significant than Aboriginal history, but because it speaks to the fundamental question of how connected the ancient world was. A question that matters enormously for our understanding of who we are as a species and what we have been capable of. The answer to the question of how connected the ancient world was is consistently and repeatedly more connected than we assumed. Every decade of modern research has pushed back the date of some form of long-distance contact that was previously thought impossible. Pacific navigation, transatlantic plant transfer, Indian Ocean genetics, pre-Columbian South American contact with Polynesia. The more we look with more sophisticated tools, the more connections we find. The Kariong Hieroglyphs are one more place to look, one more potential connection, waiting for the looking. There is also something worth saying about the emotional register of this mystery that has not yet been fully addressed. We have talked about evidence and counter-evidence, about institutional sociology and research methodology, about the specifics of Egyptian maritime capability and the politics of Australian archaeology. All of that is important, but there is another dimension to the Kariong story that operates below the level of argument, in the register of feeling rather than reason, and that dimension deserves attention too. The feeling evoked by the Kariong hieroglyphs in people who encounter them seriously, not just as a curiosity, but as a genuine puzzle, is a specific kind of feeling. It is not exactly wonder, though wonder is part of it. It is not exactly sadness, though the story the glyphs supposedly tell is a sad one. It is not exactly the intellectual excitement of a puzzle, though that is present too. It is something closer to what the Japanese call mono no aware, the pathos of things. The gentle sadness that comes from awareness of impermanence and distance, and the vast spaces of time that separate us from everything that has been lost. Standing in front of those walls and thinking seriously about what might be inscribed on them, you are aware of distance in multiple registers simultaneously. The geographical distance between Egypt and Australia, the temporal distance between the Old Kingdom and the present, the cultural distance between ancient Egyptian civilization and our own, the distance between the living person who carved those symbols and the stone that holds them now without the warmth of the hand that pressed them in. And underneath all of that distance, something that is not distant at all. The grief of losing someone far from home, the need to mark the loss in something permanent, the hope that the marking will be found and read, and that the name will be spoken again. Those things are not distant, they are immediate. They are the most human things there are, and they do not diminish across 40 centuries or 40,000 kilometers. They arrive intact. They find you where you are in your own particular distance from the people and places you have loved and lost, and they resonate there with a directness that bypasses argument and evidence entirely. This is why the Kariong mystery persists, even through all the academic dismissal and all the institutional resistance. Not because people are credulous or foolish, but because the story the site tells, if we accept even the possibility that it might be true, touches something in us that does not respond to skepticism. The grief carved into stone reaches across time and finds the grief we carry ourselves and says simply, yes. This is what it is to be human and to lose someone and to be far from home with inadequate resources to honor the loss. Yes, whether or not the hieroglyphs are genuine, that resonance is real, and it matters. It matters because it is a reminder that the people who left marks in the ancient world were not abstract historical forces or representative types. They were individuals with specific griefs and specific losses and specific inadequate means of expression who did what they could with what they had. The Old Kingdom Egyptian sailor, if he was there, was not a symbol of ancient maritime capability or a data point in the history of pre-European contact with Australia. He was a person who watched someone he cared about die and tried to do something about it in the only way available. That is the story under the story, under all the evidence and counter-evidence, under all the academic argument and institutional resistance, under the question of authenticity and dating and geographical plausibility. There is a human story of loss and the inadequate but sincere attempt to honor it. That story deserves to be taken seriously, regardless of whether the hieroglyphs are ancient or modern. Because if they are ancient, they are a 4,000-year-old document of human grief. And if they are modern, they are a document of human longing, of the desire to place grief in stone, to make loss permanent rather than ephemeral, to reach back into the deep past and find a language adequate to the weight of what cannot be held. Either way, someone felt something strongly enough to press it into sandstone in a valley in New South Wales. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The night continues to deepen wherever you are. The questions continue to be open. The stone continues to hold whatever it holds, in whatever quality of darkness exists in the Kariong Valley in the hours before dawn. When the Southern Cross has turned past its highest point and is beginning its descent toward the western horizon, when the possums have grown quiet in the canopy, when the boobook owl has found its roost, when the whole enormous bush is in the particular stillness that precedes the first grey suggestion of another day. In that stillness, the symbols on the sandstone walls of the valley are at their most themselves, not being examined, not being argued about, not being photographed or measured or translated or contested, simply existing in the darkness as they have existed through however many darknesses have passed since the hands that made them were withdrawn. Patient waiting, holding the name of someone who died far from home and wanted not to be forgotten. That patience is not passive. It is a form of endurance, the same endurance that the stone itself demonstrates, the same endurance that the Australian continent demonstrates, weathering whatever comes with a geological equanimity that makes all our urgency seem very small and very temporary. But small and temporary things matter. Temporary things are what we are. And the marks that temporary things leave in permanent materials are the most that any of us can hope to leave behind, the evidence of our brief particular presence in a world that was here long before us and will be here long after. The sealed tomb, the carved walls, the name pressed into stone, they are still there. And you, wherever you are as you listen to this, are briefly, temporarily, beautifully here too. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. The mystery rests. The stone endures. The night continues to do what nights do. And somewhere in the dark of the Kariong Valley, in a sheltered corridor between two sandstone walls covered in symbols that may be 4,000 years old or 150, in a landscape that is 40,000 years inhabited and 250 million years geological and 4.5 billion years planetary, the smallest possible human story is preserved in the most durable available medium. Someone was here, someone cared, someone did not want to be forgotten, and they are not. Not yet, not tonight. Sleep now. Let the mystery hold you gently. Let the questions soften at the edges as the mind grows quiet and the body releases the day. The stars are turning above whatever roof is over you. The sandstone in the valley is holding whatever it holds. The sealed darkness beneath the stone is intact. The morning will bring its own light, its own questions, its own version of the world reassembling itself out of the night. For now there is only this, the long quiet of the sleeping hours. and the story settling into the space between waking and dreams, where all the oldest things live. Rest well. The mystery will be waiting for you in the morning, patient as sandstone, patient as stars, patient as the ancient Australian night. It has waited this long, it can wait a little longer. And if this long wandering through the mystery of the Kariong Hieroglyphs was the company you needed tonight, then it has done its work. Somewhere between the sandstone and the stars, between the Egyptian prince and the patient Australian bush, between the carved name and the sealed darkness below it, you found your own particular quiet. That is what these stories are for. Not resolution, not certainty, not the satisfaction of a closed case. Just the long, slow, gentle movement through something real and unresolved and deeply human, until the mind releases its grip on the day and drifts toward wherever sleep takes it. The mystery continues, the stone endures, and you briefly, beautifully rest